Thank you everybody for coming back. We are going to be going through startup fundamentals today, venture fundamentals. Just as a quick note, I want this to be a discussion, right? A lot of this that we're going to be talking about today, some of it's just conventions, basic terminology, conventions, legal structures that have emerged within startup and venture ecosystem as the standards that you want to keep. And we can talk about why you don't want to really depart from that. But some of the more discussion-based aspects are going to be dependent on my experiences. You know, I worked at, I helped co-found a startup called Courier. We did get that through. I worked with Mercury Fund, working with Dan. They're smaller funds, so they have particular biases, things that they're incentivized to do. We'll talk about fund incentives today a little bit. But other people have other perspectives, and it's really dependent on the resources that they have at hand and the way that maybe their funds or their experiences have been. So I think that's a good basis for discussion. So if you have some different experiences, feel free to jump in and share them. I think they're more valuable to everybody than you think. A lot of figuring out how to do a startup is just pattern matching, putting together all the different options and trying to understand and read between the lines and figuring out what's the right path for you. So this morning is a little bit of a longer block. It actually it's going to be today and Thursday. We're fundamentally talking about this topic of starting a company and thinking about what is venture. We do go into venture more later on this year, if you saw on the curriculum, with say like Sante or Dan, to really have more discussion from their perspective of what do they like to see in fundraising. This is more mechanical, I guess, but we'll talk about it from startup perspective. We also have a panel discussion thinking about it that way. So the goal for today is really to get you a lot of the tools to learn, to continue learning, and start that conversation, because we've already been having a lot of them. It's really, I'm missing a slide. No, I'm not. It's later on. Sorry, I haven't had these specific slides before. So before we get into that though, I wanted to ask real quick, who here has started a startup? I know a couple of you have, so how many of you started a startup before? How many of you were part of this legal documentation process of starting a startup and talking to investors and reading the contracts? Okay, we got 2, 3. How many of you have been part of a startup, but maybe as like an advisor, scientific advisor? Maybe you were issued some shares. Okay, so those are all really valuable, and then all of you have invented technologies, and you're in the process of talking to your TTOs and filing patents and such, and there's interesting stories to have in there. So some of you have seen this slide before, because I used it during some of our recruitment for the cohort itself, but just fundamentally when you're thinking about starting a startup, there's 3 different routes to developing a technology, right? You find a licensing partner, you spin out a new company, which is probably the hardest option. I'm not gonna lie. My rule is, and I'm gonna tell you guys this at some point, you know, during the year too. If somebody offers you a bunch of money, you should seriously consider taking a bunch of money, right? So that's always the rule. But the reason we do a startup is there's things that have to be addressed. There's challenges that need to be addressed, and this is a way to financially support it through those challenges and make it so it's viable for a larger deal. And then the default is we're not going to continue development. So by being here, you've already sort of moved away from that default. We're going to always be asking you to recommit to that until you realize either that, yes, you are starting a startup for sure, if you haven't already, or no, you've hit a stopping point and you know, you're going to continue to focus on something else. So flexibility as you're evaluating options is always the key when you're going through this process. And then the other thing I want to always ask you to remember is you're the advocate for your technology at this stage. When you're at this early stage, all ideas look simultaneously amazing and well, not all of them look amazing, but they look either amazing or terrible, and it's really hard to tell, even if you're really sophisticated, even if it's something that ultimately ends up successful. And you are the only one really who understands about this enough, understands your field enough to help figure out how do you differentiate it from all the other stuff out there. So what you're really working against a lot of time when you're talking about venture is the information overload of all the other things they're seeing and trying to capture that attention. this is only, and because I've already been getting questions, so I wanted to sort of contextualize this into all the other things we're talking about. A lot of the curriculum, if you had a chance to look through the syllabus, is sort of centered around the different questions you need to be asking yourselves as you're going through this process. So the first question we can't answer for you. We might have opinions. Most of us are scientists. We're all industry, experts, right? We might have opinions on the scientific foundation, but you're really bringing that scientific knowledge. Your collaborators, and the other people that you would trust to give you opinions on that. We're going to talk about market, so we're not talking about that hardly at all today, really. How do you talk about market differentiation, market need, competition, and making yourself stand out? Stephanie Maros is going to be doing that for us virtually this coming month. I'm also going to have another little short session just on sort of thinking about strategic differentiation. This has already been coming up in some of our SAS sessions of how do you highlight your data in a way that helps emphasize where you're different, and how do you plan experiments strategically. IP, tech licensing, and probably a little bit more on just corporate structures is going to be Andrew Strong tomorrow. He's amazing. Some of you already know him because he's a huge member of the community. Really has been pivotal to a lot of the development. So in addition to law, he's really made himself an integral part of the life sciences community here. So he's seen a lot of deals, helped a lot of people get companies started, and just is lovely to have here. Just if nothing else, just for the perspective. Team and leadership, Tom's going to talk about that later this year. So that's not one we're doing this week. And then this week we also have a couple different ones from different perspectives on thinking about how do you start cultivating business partnerships and what do people look for. So we're not talking about most of that today. What we're talking about today then is your venture perspective and what is the terminology here and what are we thinking about as we're starting a company from a legal standpoint. The only thing I want to say about IP, though, is, again, your first opportunity to be an advocate for your technology, and I was talking to somebody yesterday, I'm not going to out them unless they out themselves, but I thought it was just a great story where they were talking about something that's now in a company, people have gotten interested in, it's received funding. Initially, not even being sure if it was worth patenting, right? And so how do you help even the people at your institutions understand that this is worth patenting, and understand it's worth going out and finding partners, that the patents are robust. So a lot of times one of the things you do when you first start a company is review the patents that your office has filed, and ensure more patents don't need to be filed to expand the claims. Really, really important to the viability of your company. So this is your first opportunity, and my advice here is always just communicate as early and often as possible. Make friends with your technology office. So, I'm not a lawyer, don't play one on TV, none of this is legal advice. This is based on my perspective as an entrepreneur and my experiences of reading all these contracts and the conventions that are out there. So, but it's good to have an entrepreneurial perspective, I think, sometimes, because we'll get legal advice from your lawyer that is correct legally, but sometimes it's like, you want A or your B, your lawyer's not actually making a decision for you. And so you understand what are the perspectives of those different levers that you could be pulling. But always find a good lawyer. This is actually one of the number one pieces of advice. When you get started with a startup, don't use LegalZoom. Don't use, right, there's actually a couple probably online platforms I could recommend. LegalZoom's not the one for startups. But even if you were to use one of those online platforms, do it and make sure you start figuring out where a good lawyer is, who you're going to work with. Most of the firms who do startups have what they call startup packages. It's only a couple $1,000s. We have a couple that we can recommend here at TMC that we work with all the time for like our biodesign companies, or if we do have other people that we're working with in the community. And the important thing is you want to make sure that you're following the NVCA standard, the National Venture Capital Association standard. Because what it does is, that's part of why they can do it so cheaply, is they're just filling in templates. But then later on, when you're talking to venture and they're doing diligence, it looks exactly like what they expect, so they're not spending a bunch of time reading it. There's nothing weird that's going to cause legal issues or cause you to get hung up in diligence. And then, so this is something I like to talk about. This is something that's actually, honestly, in my opinion, some people may not agree with me. They may already not agree with me, right? Because they may have chosen a different path, which is, my opinion is when you're getting started, just go ahead and make a C corp. It's not that much more expensive. It's a little bit more paperwork. It's so much easier, because if you're going to go down, if you think you have to go down that venture path, you might as well be in the right legal structure. And there's advantages to doing a C corp. So, first of all, it just adds credibility. It sort of signals that, hey, I did this right. I knew what I'm signing up for before I came and talked to venture. I know that this is the right legal structure for this. There are actual tax implications. What you'll find with a lot of this stuff is it just comes down to taxes. So the tax implications are, you get to issue all your shares before they're worth anything, before you've gotten a license, before you're worth anything. And then you just tell the IRS, hey, this is worth nothing. All these holdings are worth nothing. And then you don't have to worry about surprise taxes later on. It'll save legal fees, because if you have to reincorporate, you're paying a lawyer to reincorporate you, essentially, right? And issue those shares. And then allows you to move quickly if you do have fundraising. That said, many people do just form an LLC to just, say, like, write an SBIR, or just to get going, just to sort of start those conversations with our technology office. It's fine. It's all fixable. Everything's fixable with contract law.
I understand when you make the C corp, you need to have staff already established, so
No.
you don't have anybody.
No. So this is a huge, actually that's a great question, because, so the question was, when you make a C corp, do you have to have people actually in the company? And the answer is no. This is why corporations count as people according to the Supreme Court. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but this is basically the fundamental argument, is that they are separate legal entities. That's actually why they get to shelter you from liabilities, and why they have their own taxes and whatever. As far as the law is concerned, they're their own entity. Nobody has to actually exist in the corporation. A C corp does have to have a board. It doesn't have to be a substantial board. It can be like one person. The other thing that's worth considering, though, when you do this is you do have to file your disclosures with your institution. And some institutions have rules about what positions you can hold in a company. So it's something to think about. The other thing I would say is, though, is hopefully you're not just forming a company, you're gonna say, like, by the time you're forming a company, you're kind of working with people, or you kind of have an idea what that might look like. There's not really, it takes, people want to file a company way early. It takes like 2 weeks to get registered, right? So it doesn't matter, you can do it, you can start talking to the licensing office, you can start putting plans together, you can start thinking about things, and then file the company when you're ready to go. So, there's no disadvantage of doing it earlier, but there's no advantage to waiting, or disadvantage to waiting either. You okay, you have a question? Okay.
Sarah, what's the major difference between C corp and LLC?
LLC, it's taxes. So LLC is a pass-through entity. So it's a limited liability corporation. It shields you from some liability. It gives you something to tie contracts to, essentially. But really, you don't have to have, you can have, but are not required to have an operating agreement. And then fundamentally, if you get income, it just is passed through to you. So it's great if you're like a consultant, because it's just income and you don't have double taxation. The reason it doesn't work for startups is you can have a shareholders agreement, but you don't have like the same stock registration that you do for a C corp that's built into the structure, and all the legal conventions that surround that. And so in order to do, the reason it's a requirement for a startup that's going to raise venture capital or outside capital is you have to be able to issue equity with those you have to have those registrations and the protections to the shareholders that are associated with those registrations. Does that make sense? We're getting a little bit into legal definitions, so some of this might be an Andrew question, but like that's the fundamental sort of gist of it. C corps are taxed separately. It's kind of irrelevant when you're a startup, but because you're not making money for the most part. Someday, I joke that someday I might start a company that makes money, while it's a company. So equity, I think, is one of the big things that people, and part of the reason we're doing this early, even though I don't think this is the most important thing to be worrying about right now, but it's something that's very relevant and top of people's minds and thinking about how do you distribute equity, what does it mean, what's fair. And I think the fair is really the thing here, right? Because everybody gets equity is how much of a company you own, right? Nobody I think doesn't understand that. Where people get really hung up and feelings get hurt and friendships get broken and all sorts of issues is that definition of fairness. So and when you give people equity, how do they view that? How do you view that? You know, and what you're trying to think about as you're thinking about these equity allocations is you're rewarding past contributions and this is important, incentivizing continued participation. And it's that latter part I think that gets forgotten sometimes. So, what is fair, right? What are you really trying to represent in that cap table? Because remember, the cap table's meaningless, right? The cap table is monopoly money for the most part, right? Until it's not monopoly money. But 9 times out of 10, you're going to get to the end, and the company might not succeed. And fundamentally, it won't have mattered, but people, again, the relationships that you build and the way people feel about that experience, which is important to your ability to do this again, right, will be affected by the ownership. And so, inventorship, you all as the inventors, creating the foundational IP is actually hugely important. And your continued participation is hugely important. I don't think inventors always appreciate that. Both from themselves thinking about this, but also thinking about their value. So people, my experience, at least in the last couple of years, has been people either overthink the value of that inventorship or they underappreciate the value of that inventorship. They underappreciate the contributions that you are bringing as the experts in this technology. So I think it's important to keep both of that in mind. But it's also really important to keep in mind that a lot of work has to get done to make this successful, and people have to do it, and you have to make sure that they get to participate in your sites. They're going to be spending a lot of time, especially if they're the ones running the company, right? And pushing it forward. You want them to be incentivized to push it forward. There are also a lot of times the people in the company are the ones taking a large risk on, say, like their career. Your investors are taking a huge risk on, money. We're going to talk about how investors can incentivize themselves, and then, what are people bringing to the table as far as credibility, knowledge, contributions. And then, so the reason I kind of joke it's monopoly money until it's not is I never argue over the last couple %, that's my rule. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, it's not worth the relationship damage. But it's worth keeping in mind that it could be very, very valuable and you should be asking for what you deserve. But you also shouldn't get so hung up on not giving it away, trying to keep it to yourself, because, of some perceived value that doesn't have yet. So founders equity is something that people make a big deal out of. It's the equity that you issue it's, generally viewed as the equity you issue right at the formation or immediately after the formation of the company. And the reason it's an equity issuance is you're actually giving the equity away, not giving it away, you're issuing it to people at a sale price near 0, 0.000001 or some such. It can't be 0 because of tax purposes. You can't divide by 0, so you have to have something that you're increasing value from. So you might write a check for a few $100s to $1,000, depending on how many shares you're issuing. Through what's called a stock purchase agreement. Legally, there's no difference in founder shares. I think that's a huge misconception. It's just a stock purchase agreement. Now, every stock purchase agreement, you can write special things into it. You're going to give yourself headaches if you start doing too many weird things. And a good lawyer will prevent you from doing that. But it's just a stock purchase agreement. But these are the founder shares, and the reason you're doing this is right now they're not worth anything, so you can actually issue them. Stock options then, after founding, after you start getting some momentum, by and large what you're going to be issuing is stock options. Does anybody know why you do options after founding? Or want to take a guess? Everybody. Huh? Yes, you're incentivizing, but why are you doing options instead of just giving them shares?
Commit them?
Time is part of it, but we can protect that either way.
The value to go up.
Huh?
You want the value of the share to go up?
Hopefully they're all going up.
there's no tax burden for the person. who
Yes,
takes the
that's
option.
it. I was waiting for somebody to say taxes. It's always taxes. That's the rule. Is it's always taxes. The answer is always taxes. So after you form the company, get a license into it. Maybe you get a little money into it. Maybe you have it, but either way, that license is inherently valuable, right? After you get moving, your shares now have value. You can't tell the IRS anymore that it doesn't have value. They get very unhappy if you do that. And it turns out that that was not true. And there's actual ways of assessing that. That's that 490A valuation. So if you just give somebody, say, 1 million shares, you've created a huge tax liability for them that they may or may not have the free cash to deal with. So you're giving stock options, and that just says, hey, right now, each of our shares is worth 10 cents, $1 or whatever. It's about 1/10 of whatever your preferred stock shares are. That's the general rule of thumb. The 498 unfortunately costs a couple $1,000s, but it is what it is. You just have to do it. So you say, hey, right now it's worth 10 cents on the share or whatever. We're gonna agree that you can buy at any point in the future. You can buy these shares. It's not really any point. It's like up to 10 years, or when you leave the company, you get some preset window to exercise those shares. Standard convention is 90 days. This actually can hurt early employees who have, even if they fully invested, that they don't have the cash to exercise at the time. So sometimes some companies have started pushing out that window essentially indefinitely, say again 10 years or something to exercise. But that's a choice. The standard convention is 90 days.
Can you talk about that a little bit more, Sarah? So
Yeah.
like if you're an employee of a company and you want to exercise, you actually have to buy.
Yeah. So if you're an employee in the company, so like when you exercise the shares, you have to buy the share. Hopefully you're doing that because you think it's now worth more money, right? So let's say it was worth 10 cents a share when you buy it. And now you think the company's getting close to exit, or maybe you don't, but you think it's going well, but for whatever reason you're leaving the company. And so you have 90 days to exercise these shares. The kind can create two problems. The first of which is you may or may not have the cash to exercise the shares depending on what that strike price is, or that base price is, and how many shares there are. The second problem is the difference between the base price and the price at which you exercise your share. For most stock options, for most employees, there's a special category, but it's technical, I wasn't gonna worry about it right now. But for most of them, you pay the difference in the spread in taxes. And so if it costs you, and because that is considered income, the reason you're giving this to people is it's essentially a compensation mechanism. And so that difference in the strike price to the value when you exercise them then is now magically income. It goes on your IRS taxes, which you may or may not have the cash to deal with, right? And so that can create a conflict for people, which is why sometimes a lot of people who are employees of startups don't end up they'll go through several startups, they might not exercise any of their shares because they can't for whatever reason. Which is why philosophically, I'm a fan of the extended window, but the convention, like I said, the convention's 90 days. But some startups, some firms are even recommending go ahead and extend that window when people leave up to 10 years for them to exercise the options. The other way you can exercise them still creates a tax liability, but you just don't care about it, is when you sell the company. So you do what's called a cashless exercise, and it says, at the moment that we sold the company, I exercised the shares and immediately spent the money from the proceeds, essentially, or you get the proceeds and you spend the money to buy the shares all at the same time. The accountants figure out what the balance is. You'll still be liable for the taxes, so if you should find yourself in such a lucky situation, you should talk to an accountant who is sophisticated with equity allocations, such as from startups. When you're talking about a cap table, technically none of the options actually show up on. Technically they're not exercised. Technically they're not shareholders, which has some legal implications for, say, voting rights and shareholder protections. But by and large, when you're talking about the cap table, you just represent all of those options that you put out there as if they've been fully exercised. It's called fully diluted. So, and that just helps you keep track of it. There's tons of platforms to keep track of this now, so you don't ever have to do it. I'm just telling you all this because these are the sort of conventions, the way people think about it. No, the reason,
Sorry, what, the previous slide, what is the 490A?
yeah,
valuation?
so sorry, the 490A valuation is the value, so when you issue those shares, those options, you have to set what's called a strike price. That's the price at which they can buy each share. You have to do it at market value, which is challenging for a startup because of course you're not trading these shares, right? So how do you determine market value? And so you work with an accounting firm that has experience in this, or Carta does this now. Carta is a capitalization table management platform essentially. Sweet deal, honestly. You can do it. I loved it when we switched to Carta. And they do what's called a 490A valuation, which they look at comparables, they do accounting magic, and they come back and they say it's worth 10 cents a share. As a general rule, it's about 1/10 of whatever your last preferred equity issuance was. It's a little bit hairier if you've not had any preferred equity issuances, but there's ways that they do it, so.
So those are done by accountant, not lawyer.
It's done by your accountant. Some law firms will do it as well.
So I mean, for the shares, so if you don't exercise for employee or you don't sell it, you don't need to pay tax. I mean, all you have to do is
You don't
sell it.
exercise, you don't pay taxes.
Right, yeah.
So until you have to exercise it, it's just options that you're holding. They don't create a tax liability until you exercise them.
So along the line of taxing, so for example, you have a company, but at the beginning, you don't have any income, you don't spend anything, you just say, okay, I have an advisor, I give you some options, something like that. And this situation, do you need to still pay, file the tax return this year? If you don't have any activity, materialized activity or?
It's a good question. Probably would. I think you still have to file a form
Yeah, I think
that says
it's
we didn't do
for the
anything.
company.
Yeah.
The company have to, even if you don't have any income, you have to.
Yeah. You just file a form that says.
It's a real easy, just a zero return. It's,
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's like 5 million.
Sarah, can you explain again, fully diluted, what does that mean?
Yeah, so fully diluted. So the options are not purchase shares. So they're not actually shareholders. They just have these pieces of paper that say they could be shareholders if they wanted to, and they paid the money. So technically, let's say you're just starting out. You have a really simple cap table. You're founders, and you recruited some people, and some people even so I said like typically you do this until you do this because there's value. The other reason people do it is they like to keep a distinction between founders and not founders, and that's just it's not a real legal difference. It's just a thing that people do, right? So they might issue options or something. So even if there's no good reason to do this for like a value reason, they're still not shareholders. So you would still say be 100% owner, right? The fully diluted is how many options are out there. So you just count all of those options as if they've all been exercised when you're representing your cap table. The other thing I didn't actually mention is when the options are created, the reason it's called stock option pool is you form them in pools. So like you found a company, you said we're gonna have 10 million shares, 8 million are gonna be issued to the founders, 2 million are being retained as what's called an option pool. So they've been registered with Delaware in this case, but nobody actually owns them, the company still owns them. Technically, if you just let's say you sold the company a few months later before you fully, when you're talking to investors, you'll represent your cap table as if it's all of those options belong to somebody, right? Because you could be using them, you're gonna be continuing to use them to incentivize people, to recruit, to do whatever. But if you sell the company before you issue all those options, then they don't count because they're not actually issued. Nobody owns them, right? So that's the undiluted capitalization table versus the fully diluted. You'll see two lines a lot of times when you see, like if you get a document back from your lawyer, that's your pro forma capitalization table. It'll show equity holdings, and it'll show fully diluted equity holdings. You look a little confused still. Does that make sense at all? Sorry, I wasn't trying to call you out. I was just like, It's kind of confusing because it's easier if you can see it. We're gonna look at it a little bit, but essentially the way you think about the options is, if you give somebody options, just think about it as you've issued them shares, whether or not they've actually exercised them, and then maybe you get them back at some point in the future, right?
It's also like a communication thing, right? So like if you're talking to an investor, you want to be on the same page if you're talking about diluted or not diluted. And so the convention is to talk about it as fully diluted so that everybody knows like what
the
we're talking
allocations
about.
are, if
Yeah.
everybody who's involved in the company can cash in those checks essentially for those options. So there's a,
So, let's say you have multiple funding rounds and you issue different options for each round, and then they have different strike price. Do you, like, as employees, do you have the ability to exercise which ones first?
yeah. So the old way of just like asking the lawyers to keep track of this or hoping your manager was keeping track of it was terrible. So my recommendation is just get on. Carta has really nice startup packages that are pretty cheap. So once you really start to get going, you don't need to worry about it yet. Once you really start to get going, just get on a platform like Carta. And the great thing for the employees is they can see it all. They can initiate the conversion themselves if they want. It just reduces your overhead, makes it so everybody has that full transparency to everything. Documents can't get lost. Nobody comes out of the woodwork being like, oh yeah, remember how you issued this to me? And you're like, I don't remember that at all. So this is the right way to do it.
So Carta is a software platform for managing this. We have relationships with them, so if anyone is at that stage where they're about to raise money, like talk to Carta, we can talk about that.
And that's Carta, C-A-R-T-A?
C-A-R-T-A.
Okay.
Strongly recommend it. They actually do have an incorporation package, I think, that they were piloting as well. Mixed results. Lawyers hate it. It's probably fine. Honestly, this paperwork is so standard. The initial stuff, it's when you need your lawyer. You need your lawyers for like everything else. Right? So you do want to have that relationship and at least have that be part of the conversation. The reason you're doing this is, you know, to incentivize people, right? So a lot of times you're cash poor. You have lots of aspirations, perspiration. You don't have a lot of money. And so you're trying to balance out the fact that, hey, you want really talented people to come work with you instead of just going and working for Pfizer where they can make several $100,000 a year if they're any good, really easily, right? Get home by 5 and, you know, hang out with their kids. And so you're trying to reflect that value. So the earlier you are, the more of an allocation you're going to give people as a percentage of your total. The later you are, yeah.
So ideally, the pool should always be filled.
Yes.
So what happens if it runs dry? I mean,
You make a new
before
pool.
you even.
Yeah, you just make a new pool. It's like 2 slides from now, but yeah, you just make more pools, and if your pool runs out, you just make another pool. With the board gets together and says, yep, we're
So
okay.
you issue more.
Yeah. So, new hires, I think everybody thinks about that. You do new hires. Sometimes people forget as they're growing a company to top people up as you get more resources. So for promotions, if you give someone a new title, reflect that with the new issuances to bring them up to whatever that title would be valued at. Performance bonuses, I've seen in contracts, hey, if we get this deal done by this date, you'll get these issuances. You hear about this actually a lot with companies that are being sold or major milestones coming up. So this tends to be a little bit higher up, but just something to keep in mind. And then, continuing to incentivize people as they've been with the company. So yeah, you gave them issuances early on, but a lot of turnover in startup land sometimes, and so you want to make sure people stay with you. And part of the reason you need to do that is because all options and your stock purchase agreements at the beginning should be vesting. So I'm gonna go over here and get some water. So there we go. So vesting is what you do to both protect the company, you as the founders, and your investors. Investing says, we're giving you this right now, but you don't actually fully get it until you get a schedule going. The conventional schedule is 1 + 3 or 1 + 4. So depends, honestly. So the one is, if you leave the company within the first year, you actually don't get anything. This is the answer to, this is good. Some people get really upset about this when they think about this as a founder. But this is good. Founders fall apart. Everything's rosy when you start. And then you realize, you get going, you're like, this is a lot more work than I thought it was gonna be, a lot harder. I got this great opportunity to go do this other job. I got grants to do. I'm gonna go do that. And so, if they leave early on, you don't want them to have this huge allocation on the cap table that was anticipating that they would be at this level of effort, and then they left you, and now you have to explain to investors why you're giving a huge bunch of the company to somebody who's not doing anything. So that's that 1 year clip. After that, you get the first 25% at 1 year, and then the next 3 years is just monthly on a fractional schedule, so it just steps up. Technically, if it's a stock purchase agreement, what it is this company has a right to repurchase the shares. And for stock options, their right to purchase at that price increases over time. But the reason you gave the options all at once is for tax purposes. So you can set that lower valuation. And so you put a stake in the ground, you're like, yes, you're gonna be able to buy them all at this price, but your ability to make that purchase increases over time. Does that make sense to everybody? Does this surprise anybody? Or is this a familiar concept? The one thing I will say is, do you enforce this? I've seen cases where people did not enforce this. At the time, it seemed easier. It's a really difficult conversation to stop somebody's vesting because they're not participating. Company's early stage, doesn't seem to matter. The further along you get, the more it matters to people, and they get really upset, and it decentivizes people. And the way I view incentives, or payroll and equity, is it's not actually a very good incentive. It's not a very good incentivizer, if that makes sense. People aren't like, oh, I'm gonna get rich off this, therefore I'm gonna do it. How many times have you just like not wanted to go to work, even though it's your job, right? So people don't do things just because they're supposed to, but they will stop doing things if they feel like they're not being treated fairly. So that's important. So the dilution. So
before we go forward, I just want to say all of this stuff is the details behind getting to a point where there's no reason for an investor to say no based on technicalities, right? Like, you want to set yourself up for an investor, for a strategic partner, for an acquirer to be able to say yes to the science, to the progress, the milestones, and not have to say no because you have some random co-founder that has 30% of the company but hasn't done any work for 3 years. That's an easy reason for an investor to just be like, no, I don't want to deal with this. This is going to be a mess to clean up. It's going to be expensive, all that kind of stuff. So
absolutely,
all of the stuff, the vesting, the pools, the equity, is all about making sure that you're informed of the terms and the norms, and we'll always be able to help you with all of these questions, but set it up for yourselves and your companies so that there's no reason for anybody to say no to continuing to work with you.
Yeah, that's a great point, because part of the reason we're spending a lot of time, as a scientific founder, you might be wondering, why do I don't need to worry about this, but you do, because you should at least understand when you're signing a bunch of documents what the documents mean. So I'm a huge advocate for that, because people can get taken advantage of. But also, this kind of stuff, even though it's pretty standard, does kill deals all the time. All the time. Who the heck is this person on here, and what are they doing, and who's this person that popped up on the cap table? And it's because the investors are investing in you or your company executives as much as they're investing in the technology to be able to execute on that. They want to make sure everybody's aligned to make this successful. So dilution, then, what I said earlier is people often use the phrase giving away equity, and that's not actually a correct term. Because you never really, you pretty much never take equity away from existing shareholder or option holder. You just issue more shares, and it squashes everybody else down to some degree. But it's actually a really important distinction because each round you distribute the dilution across more and more shareholders. And as an example, so, and you should be creating value at each step, and that's really important. So, the dilution first step. So at the beginning, you start up your company, you say, we're gonna do this, you put your founders, you give them 85% of the company, you create a 15% option pool. And you essentially are worth zero at that point because you don't have anything in that company. You do a little work, you issue some options. So at each step here, what I'm doing is just assuming you've used all those options and then create a new pool for this next round of financing, right? So you issue options, so now you have some common shareholders. You create a new pool prior to your next round of financing, which is an important rule. And then you raise some money. And so your investors say, this is great, I like what you've done here, I like the team you're starting to put together, the technology. We're gonna give you a $6 million pre-money valuation. We'll give you $3 million to do the next step. You dilute 33%, and what you'll notice is it's not, this is the biggest cut you're gonna see, but it's distributed across actually the existing shareholders. So it's not fully just 33% from the founders or anybody else. And all of a sudden your shares are actually worth something. So now you've actually made $4 million, so that's something. That's cool. It's all on paper, so it's not real money, but you know, it's kind of fun to say, right? Do another round, another 40% dilution. You'll notice again, you took another huge haircut, but it's not as big of a haircut as last time. And you issued more shares. Again, all of those options I just assumed converted into common stock. And then we created a new option pool for this next round of financing. And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna keep going through that. And your goal is by the time you IPO, let's say you get so lucky and you IPO, and you do a $200 million IPO, you end up with $1 billion market cap, right? And you only own 5% between all the founders, so maybe you specifically only own a couple percent, 1%, 2%, right? But founders only own 5%. But those shares are worth $54 million, and even if you only had 1/5 of that, let's say you had a bunch of co-founders, you'll never have to work again. You probably will, because you'll be bored, but you don't ever have to, right? So these are good problems to have. This is why I have a rule, like, don't argue about the last percent or two, because people get so focused on this dilution, and that's a life-changing amount of money. And in biotech, it's very biphasic, so you end up usually at zero, or a lot of money, and there's not as many middling exits in biotech. So you should be so lucky as to be unhappy that you didn't get the last percent or two, like, right? So, you know, my perspective is don't sweat the small stuff. It's a lot of money, it's real money, but at the end of the day, whatever. This is all gonna be shared. I just gonna plug it real quick, because I did this last year as a side project, because I was getting a bunch of questions about this, what normal dilutions are in biotech specifically, and I pulled a bunch of data and I created a graph that you can go to, and those are real companies, where it kind of shows an estimate of dilution over funding events in biotech and how wildly variable they are. So that's with real data. I hope anybody who looks at it likes it, but we'll be the extent you. Fundamentally, the basic rule is this is a really simple equation, but it's worth keeping in mind. Anytime you give away equity, if it increases the value of your company more than the value of that equity, of the remaining equity that you have, it was worth it, right? So, you hire a new CEO, you give them 10% of the company. Pretty standard, actually, for like a non-founder CEO, would be about at least 10%. And so all they need to do is increase the value of the company more than 11%. A good CEO is gonna do that, right? A good CEO should be doing way more than that. And so your shares are now worth a lot more, right? So that's the way you think about this, is when you think about investors. Picking the right investor partners is actually really, really important, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But essentially, this is an easy trade to make. This I borrowed from Osage University Press. I'm gonna give you guys a second to look at it, and I wanna ask you what you think. We are gonna send these slides out, I promise. find this surprising? What are people's reactions when they look at these allocations?
I think it's too much for the founding CEO.
You think what?
It's too much for the founding CEO.
The founding CEO.
60%.
So you think up to 60%, depends on the founding CEO, but yeah, I think that's good base. Why do you think that? Out of curiosity.
I assume simply because, for example, you show us, if you go back to the seed and the other, so all your, okay, so all your assumptions here are based on the fact that you have to go to venture capital. But after you have the startup, you can go to Gates Foundation,
You can.
Google Foundation if you are in Seattle. If you are in Houston, you can go to CIPRI, to the owner of Texans, and to make donations like foundations, which will put in the company $millions of dollars. So the seed money can come basically from a foundation, from CIPRI grants, from startup, from SBIR and so on. And you don't dilute anything. And then, when you have the intellectual property done, the in vivo experiments done, all these things, then instead of getting the Series A, you sell the company because anyway you own 40–50% of the thing.
That's a fair point. So the less equity you give away, or the less venture funding you raise.
And then a CEO.
Yeah.
It's really a secondary because the most important is the moment are the scientific founders.
Yeah.
Because they deal with the science and they deal with a set of experiments who are selling the company quite early, but having each of the founders, as you said, 20, 25, 30%.
Okay, that's a fair.
So I see a second round that the people in the room have to be aware that in a state like Texas, where there are a lot of money for these startups, you don't have by rule to go to venture capitals. You will not arrive to IPO, but you will sell the company at a stage where you don't have any more 0.5 or 0.25%. You can have 25% of a company to value 20 million.
That's fair. So there's a huge argument for that. So in biotech right now, you see hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars right now going into preclinical companies, and then they're IPOing, which is crazy. But then again, some is worth like, I think $4 billion. They've lost $1 billion off of their market cap as a preclinical company. So yes, I agree. There's a strategy. This is part of why you shouldn't make some of these agreements before you kind of know what your strategy is going to look like. And part of your goal right now is to figure out what are the options in front of you. That's why I said flexibility is the key. Potentially, you could just raise money from individuals, high net worth individuals, particularly if you're already say an endowed chair. Whoever's endowing your chair might be interested in that. If you're not, then maybe that's not an option for you, right? So you're looking for partners, you're looking for opportunities. I would argue, look, I've seen both. I've seen people take huge allocations as a founding CEO from a company who are worse than useless, who actively hurt a company, ruin the opportunities for people to raise money on really great technologies. It happens around here more than I'd like to say. And they don't add value, right? I've also seen plenty of people who just try and start companies by themselves and they sit around for 5 or 6 years. Maybe nobody's even in it full time. It sits there for 5 years and then it collapses because from a lack of attention. And so I think if somebody's actually a founding CEO who's a full-time person, they might be worth that. It's part of why you do investing. It also depends on the person. If they're the kind of person who can bring the networks to get you money right away and let you go a lot faster, maybe that's worth it to you. Grants are awesome. They're non-dilutive. They also are a lot slower. We're gonna talk about that more, but I think any of these are good options, but the point is you need to have an understanding. I don't think this is completely crazy though. It might be a little, 60% is gonna be the high side for sure. You gotta make sure that you really think that person's worth it. It also depends on how many people are over here, how many founding scientists there are, right? You might be more or less. Passive founding scientists, essentially what you're doing is you're relegating yourself to an advisor. Passive versus active does not mean you have to quit your job. It's how involved are you in making this successful, right? Yeah.
And do titles for that matter? So for example, officially at UT Southwestern, I cannot hold the title of CTO or CSO or something like that. The institution doesn't allow. So it's really more what's actually happening, right? Because So just because, let's say, you're on the scientific advisory board, but you actually still active without having the official title as CSO, for example, like. Like how does it, I mean, do labels matter
No,
in that
the way
sense?
people would people will use the labels because it helps them go get funding. The way they would reflect it would be like founder and chair of the scientific advisory board, right? Or co-founder, right? No. Here's what I would say. What matters is the time that you put in. I would expect to put in at least 20% of your time. Many of the institutions are okay with that, especially if it's from their institution. You have to file your outside. I'm having so much issues with all this talking. You have to file your outside activities disclosure. It's not about the label per se. The labels in startup land are mostly about perception. Like, I honestly, right? Especially early startup. It's about the time that you're committing. I was involved in a company like Courier where our founder was putting in like 150%. He was a surgeon, he was a scientist, and he managed to find a bunch of time to add to it. And we compensated him, well, and I think that was fair. I was involved in another company, one of the other companies we had where the founder called in sometimes, right? And barely picked up the phone when we emailed him. Wasn't super useful. I think a smaller allocation would be more appropriate in that case.
The largest variation here seems to be at the university equity. So I was wondering, what determines a 2% versus 30%, which seems to be big.
Time.
What kind of contribution?
Who's going to push stuff forward? Yeah. So what did the 2% versus the 30%? Oh, the university founding equity. Oh. Oh man, that's an interesting question. I'm a little battle scarred after this last year, dealing with some of the institutions. So I've seen 0. I've seen 50. I've heard of 50. I haven't seen 50. I don't know if I'd be as interested in participating if the university had 50. Depending on the technology, I'd have to think it was so valuable that even if I gave away half the company, my remaining equity was worth my time, if that makes sense. Stage is a lot of it. So for preclinical early stage products, many institutions, though not as many as I'd like, will have what's called essentially something along the form of like a quick start license or a standard license or whatever. And those will have standard terms, and if you're willing to accept the standard terms, then they're usually decently, you're usually decent, right? If you're willing to accept those terms, you can just go in, essentially say, I'm licensing this, and they decide whether or not you're worth licensing it to, but if they're willing to license it to you, off you go, and you have your quick license. The more mature a product is, and or the more valuable they think it is, the worse those terms will get from the university. So if it's a preclinical versus something, maybe some of the institutions have their own manufacturing facilities, like they're actually GMP quality, so maybe you've done a lot of that work already. That's going to be more. If it's a partnership with the university, so you're running your clinical trials or something at the institutions, which some of the institutions around here do, they might ask for a lot more, but you don't have to give that to VC. Like your clinical trial costs are now way cheaper. They're essentially a partner to you, right? You don't have to pay as much in clinical trial costs, and you don't have to raise that from VC. So at least you know going in what you're giving away. That could be worth it. I consider that in a heart. I think it's worth it.
Sarah, in your experience, have you seen where if the university ownership gets above 10% or 5%, that impacts negatively on the investors later?
Yeah, it can. It's not a rule. It depends. But yeah, for sure. We're hitting time, and we're not. Man, I was worried I was gonna have slides, and I'm glad we have the time that we have. So let me see. Oh, we have one last thing. So I'm gonna give it 2 more minutes for but I wanna actually say a couple things here. So yes, it can. So I wanna make sure I answer your question. It doesn't have to. Board provisions can hurt you. It doesn't have to, right? Too high of milestones, so maybe they're not as worried about equity because the investors are less worried about equity. It's not something that has what's called anti-dilution provisions, which is to say they'll hold that percentage until you raise X funds or have X value. So if it's just a straight equity agreement, they're like, look, we'll up the people that we want, we'll make sure people feel compensated and we're not as worried about it. But we are worried about all these milestones, because you have milestones that say your IND for a couple $1 million, and that's gonna have to come out of venture money, and so we're gonna put the money in to send it to the university before we even get a clinical result. So too heavy of milestones can be equally or more impactful, right? So there's a lot of different components of that license can be more of an issue. The variability here, just to let us know the variability, they are huge. This is why people are like, what's a fair amount? It's like, I don't know, what do you think is fair? Right? Fair is a huge component of like, how much do you want something, and what are your alternative options, right? And who are you talking to, and what can they bring to the table? That's what fair is. There's no right answer. There's conventions of ranges, but they're hugely variable. So that's a discussion for you and your co-founders, and it's a fraught one. And it's worth spending the time to do it right, instead of just cutting things equally, because people will start to sense that things are unfair later, and that can kill a company. It kills companies all the time. People just stop being interested in working on them.
And have conversations with other founders and mentors to help you assess, like, is this person worth it? Is this deal too stringent? All that kind of stuff. Build your community around you of other people that you can get some context around, you know, is 10% in this case, you know, too high?
Yeah. Because I think George's point is correct, is valid too. Like I said, this is all perceptions. Right now we're talking about this with the perception that you are going to raise venture. Certain CEOs can bring a lot of connections or ability to do that. But you don't have to. I think biotech can be done more cheaply than people think.
Yeah, so for this one, my experience is like the investor look at your
Shut down, speak up.
Yeah. Okay.
Just be louder, that's all.
So my experience, because like I already found several company and meet the funding, several funding investors. So my experience is the structure. We have to have one like a founder, the major founder, which means for like 1 to 50%. And the second one is about 20% and then like 10% something like that. It's about like 6 to 2 or 7 to 1. That's like a very healthy structure. But who will be the major? Could be CEO, could be the founder. It really depends on who can create the value, who's the most strong. So that's I think how to do this. For example, the CEO is formal J&J president. People will give you the money because you have the power. So definitely CEO is or if like the scientific founder is like a big chair and people just will give you the money. They don't care about the CEO and the founder. So I think that's my experience. It really depends on the CEO, CSO, who's like that. I think that's, for example, if like J&J president comes to me and leads from a company, definitely if the 20%, 30% come over. Or if like junior CEO comes to me, that's kind of what
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Stefan. And I think that's exactly right. And the only thing I would add to it is.
Yeah, and one more point.
Oh no, go ahead.
So you have to keep in mind there are universities like MD Anderson who do not allow you to have 51% shareholding. If you have it, they send you the email, send you the reminder that in 2 weeks, please give up all your MD Anderson properties and we send you for your. It happened to me. Also, I had 17%. They were reading wrongly my give up all your properties, we send for your contribution. Okay, I called, they say also, we read wrongly your email, it's not over 50, 17, 25%. This is a 5 8 years they done over 50. So I don't speak from, there are very different things. The universities are taking very different decisions.
Yeah. So it's 50% of the line at MD Anderson?
So basically, you can allow your own account, but you cannot have like more than 10%, 20% time effort. You cannot have the position in the company. For example, you write charity. So the CEO, the CSO, centralized the final effort, then make a job company. But that's ownership. That's ownership. We're looking at own the 60% of the company, but your final effort in this company to be 25. We need the work company.
We're gonna do one more question and we're gonna take a break, for about 10 minutes. So-
Are there instances where early investors can bring their own management candidates? And
Sorry, can you, I can't hear you.
Are there incidents where early investors
Yes.
can bring their own management experts to join the team and
Yes.
become the
All the time, particularly in biotech. So we're gonna talk about that next section, because I heard it, not in detail, but we'll have a quick discussion about that, because that happens all the time.
And Sarah, thank you very much. Maybe you can also compare the slide with the timeline. So what is the median timeline that should be according to our expectation between the startup, seed, the Series E, B? So
Oh, yeah. The reason I didn't do that is it's so variable right now. Thought about it. It's so dependent on like what stage are you starting at and where are you going. Like I said, companies last year were IPOing preclinically. Maybe they'd only existed 2 years or less, right? And there's a few venture firms that are really good at company creation and getting them to IPO really quickly and getting the cash out. So that markets have shifted a little bit. That's slowing down again, but that perception, the timeline. One thing I will say is my opinion, and I think I have data to support this. I've actually done some analyses of this. People will focus on, oh, biotech has to be a 15, 20-year endeavor. It doesn't, because people are selling sooner. You're selling, if not most of the time not preclinically, but phase 1, phase 2 is not crazy in today's climate to sell to pharma. And so that's like a 5 to 7 year endeavor, depending on how quickly you're executing. So that's well within the realm of normal startups, normal tech startups. So, this is a great discussion. I'm not stopping it, but I'm stopping it for you don't have to do it with me. We're gonna take a 10-minute break, and be back here about 1:15. So keep talking to each other. Somebody commented, they said, universities sometimes require the inventors to not be part of the licensing negotiation. A lot of them, I think all the UT system ones do, certainly, and it's not uncommon otherwise. And that's absolutely true, and it's relevant to the equity discussion because you're conflicted either way, right? So as an inventor, any money that comes back from the patents, you get anywhere between, it's usually about 30 to 50, I think it's like 30 to 40% typically, right? All that money goes directly to you, right, or your co-inventors, according to some distribution. So you're incentivized either way because you're incentivized to be pulling money out of the company earlier by creating these milestones that are going to bring money back to you and help de-risk your efforts, I guess. And also, and I think that's also relevant to the equity discussion because no matter what at success, don't forget those milestones can be really substantial. So, many times they're years on the road, but if they're years on the road and somebody else did it and you get a giant check someday, then that's awesome, right? So, so you're incentivized you're conflicted from that perspective, but the institutions also will sometimes view it as a conflict because you're also conflicted, you're trying to pull money away from the departments and the institution maybe by taking equity holdings instead of worrying about those, the proceeds through say, milestones or revenue shares. So either way you're conflicted, and so as a general rule, this is part of why you need a business partner before you really go into those discussions. Not always. Many times. So, VC and angel investing. So, as I pointed out, and I think it's an entirely, there's no way to show this, that's really sad. As was pointed out, and it's entirely accurate, you don't have to raise money from venture. There's a huge argument to be made to getting some of these deals, some of these licensing deals are happening super early, right? You could just continue doing R01s, right? Get your publications, work with your institutions. Some of the institutions are doing this more and more. MD Anderson, I think, is an obvious example of this, right? But at UT Southwestern and some of the other institutions are doing a lot of this. Developing the technologies internally, working with the resources that you have at hand, and then letting your institution help you make that big licensing deal. Some of the offices do this better than others. And it also depends on the technology. What can you get done in an institution? What is available to you? And that's why I said startups are a mechanism to get things done that you can't get done in an institution. But you can also still spin it out. You can do SBIRs, you can do STTRs, you can do CPRIT product development grants. They do require matching funds, but you'll raise a lot fewer funds. Right? And foundation money. LLS, for example, the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, considers themselves almost an investor. They have a startup funding mechanism, even though they're a nonprofit. So those are huge advantages, and we're going to be talking about those a lot more. We're going to talk about SBIR, we're going to talk about CPRIT, and we're going to support your applications for that, because particularly at these early stages, it's a great way to put off taking that first giant haircut as far as raising money, and you'll be able to raise money on a much more mature product, which will get you better valuation. But yeah, dilutive investors are a major, I think, look, unless you're going to be able to sell this preclinically, which sometimes you can, most times you can't, you should at least have this as a view of something that you're likely to have to do, which is investors through, we're going to talk about angels and venture capitalists mainly. Friends and family are a do at your own risk. And there's some downsides to that too. Picking your first investors is actually really important. Your first investors hopefully will follow you through and help you get to the next round. A good first investor will. A bad first investor will do the opposite of that. So if you're just taking money from Joe Schmo, who has no idea what the technology is, other credible later stage investors will look at that and say, well, that doesn't give me any validation that this is a good technology, because their vote of confidence isn't meaningful because they don't know what they're looking at, right? So highly technical product like this, those first investors, even if it's an angel investor, even if they themselves aren't funding later, good angel investors are incentivized to help you find later stage investors because they want their money to be worth something later on. So
that doesn't mean you shouldn't take money from Joe Schmo if that's really what you need to go
Yes.
to the next step. So like, you know, if you're like, at the end of the day, people will advise you like, oh, get the best, most sophisticated investor you can, but like you're the one running the business and maybe you just need the cash to move forward, and that's how you're gonna get to the next milestone. So if you need to, and if you think that's the right decision for your company,
sure.
then do it. But if you have any option to take a sophisticated investor, then it's worth taking a slightly worse deal, because the goal would be for them to add a ton of other value, like new hires, like the next round investors, as part of working with them. So
It's the you can. And also you can do a blend. As long as you have at least one or two more sophisticated people on, you can fill out the rest of the round, particularly if it's a seed round, with whoever you want. It doesn't matter. That's okay. You just want to make sure you try and get at least one partner of some sort who can bring you some credibility. The great thing about being a startup right now in biotech is it is growing really fast. It has been just exponential growth in the last few years. Since 2010, this was a really recent report put out by Deal Pharma, which is a platform that we have access to that helps track life sciences deals and startups specifically. Just as a quick side note, we can help run competitive analyses and look up companies and such through them. So you can ask us to help you look up that kind of information. 13.6x in the last 10 years. Just in the last 5 years, we've got a 5x for the amount of venture funding into biotech. Biotech funding is still a lot smaller than tech funding, but the number of, in the last couple of years, like billion-dollar funds that have been formed is crazy. And then at the long tail of that is there's lots and lots of smaller funds popping up of varying quality. But you know, good overall, because more money means that there's more opportunities for somebody to get excited about what you're doing. And more competition, so you get better valuations when there's a lot of money in the market, because more people need deals, like they need deals to make money. There's been a little bit of drop off over last year. There was a spike right at the beginning of COVID, dropped off a little bit towards the end of the year. I think overall you can see that the trend's going up and it's sort of a part of that normal cycle. So, I don't know, I'm optimistic. I don't know about anybody else, so. So the types of investors is important. So, somebody asked about this earlier. So they said, you know, so I think these are all pretty obvious. We talked about this a little bit. Institutional venture capital investors. So you have your classic VC. You form the company. You find all the people, or you find a CEO or somebody who helps you find all the people. Put together a plan. You go give venture, and you give them that 20 to 30%. There's also something called the venture creation model. there's a lot of bigger biotech firms, and these are the rounds where you'll see they come out of the gate as a brand new company with, say, like $40 million, right? Brand new company, preclinical, $40 million. You're like, what did they do? You get a really big investor like 5 AM Ventures or Third Rock or one of these other ones that really likes Flagship, that really likes to do this venture creation model, and they say, look, we're founding this with you. We know some really amazing executives. We know the right consultants. We'll help diligence this. We'll put together the right plan. Essentially, they're co-founding it with you. And they take an appropriate cut for that. So what happens technically, usually what happens for the technical founders in that case is you might only get 10% or something, right? 10, 15%. But it's the same 10 or 15% you would probably end up with by the time you got done filling out that staff, and now you're getting started with $40 million. So, you know, it's not necessarily a bad deal. You just have to have expectations. They only do that on things that they think are going to be really big. If you're starting at $40 million for your first round, you're planning to put in $100 million maybe a year or so later, and then you're planning to put in a few $100 million more, or IPOing it. So it's got to be sustainable to get them the returns they want. That's the other thing that tends to drive those. It's something to consider, right? It happens a lot. The other thing that happens is sometimes they look like venture firms, but they're not a venture firm. They're really more what I would call a venture studio. They don't necessarily have a huge bucket of money. They might have some operating capital, but for the most part, they're syndicating deals, either through pulling together investors as independent parties or through what's called a special purpose vehicle, which is essentially just like a little mini fund specifically for a specific deal. And there's typically centered around an operations team. So you might have a group of entrepreneurs who have done this before, who have been successful, who want to go do it again. This is happening a lot, particularly in highly specialized areas like RNA therapeutics right now or cell therapy. You're seeing a lot of these venture studios crop up that want to specialize in this because it's a good area. They think they have a team, they have the specialized knowledge they need to do to execute it again. And they want to maybe run a couple projects at once, early stage, figure out which one's going to get traction through those early seed stages and then go with it, right? But it's worth remembering when you're talking to them. They are bringing a team. They may or may not be bringing as much capital as they advertise. They can be really good deals though. Again, like these are all. It's really dependent on the firm. And to Emily's point earlier, reputation really matters in this business. And so you should have somebody that you can talk to. Corporate venture tends to do a little bit later stage, typically. So that's the Merck Venture Fund or the Amgen Venture Fund. Venture capitalists that aren't corporate venture people tend to think that corporate venture is not very good. Corporate venture can be really good. They also work with some other venture capitalists in the business because they bring a potential path to exit with them. Kind of just depends. And then a lot of CROs are kind of viewing themselves as like venture partners now as well. So WuXi will invest, for example, sometimes. And maybe they're investing directly with cash or they're investing with in-kind services. So again, they're bringing you stuff that you don't have to raise other capital for. So your angel investors are actually a really important part of the story. Can be challenging for biotech because particularly around here, a lot of the angel investors view biotech as a challenging category because they think they're going to get so squashed down versus the amount of check that they can write right now. But they can be really powerful. A lot of times they're a serial entrepreneur, or maybe a family office is writing angel type checks, and they're staying in the game. Like you're a serial entrepreneur, you've had some success, you don't necessarily want to do in a startup because it's really hard, but you want to stay in the game, be active, give back to the community. You view this as a way to be involved in companies, or they're trying to get into the VC game, and so they're using this to build up a portfolio of investments that they can point to raise a larger fund. But they can be really powerful advisors. Good angels will have investors, later stage investors that they invest with, that they're connected to, and that they can carry your company to. And those investors know that the projects that that person has put money into, like they've already diligence, right? They consider them a sophisticated partner. The other thing that you'll see sometimes is angels investing together. So you'll see something that's like an angel network, like the Houston Angel Network Fund, or you'll see an angel fund, which is really like a micro VC, which is it's really a fund structure, but it's much smaller. So that's like Texas Halo Fund is really a micro VC, although Rob doesn't like it when I say that. So most of the time when angels invest, they invest in what's called a convertible note. Around here, the alternative to that is a SAFE. Essentially, it's not a priced round. So earlier when I was talking about priced rounds, I said you raise X millions of dollars on X pre-money valuation, you give away a bunch of, X amount of your company. What this says is, I want to give you $500,000 today. We're not sure what that's actually worth, right? And so when you raise your next round, I'll get a discount to that round because I took a chance on you. Okay? I'll get a 20% discount. Now, the thing people sometimes forget is there's oftentimes, most of the time, a valuation cap, which really does set a price, right? Because hopefully you get above that valuation cap on your next round. So the valuation cap might be $3 million, right? So if your valuation cap is $3 million and you raise $1 million, you've effectively, even though it's not formally reflected on your cap table yet, given away a quarter of your company. Does that make sense to everybody? Or if you raise less than $3 million, you give them that 20% discount at whatever share price you give to your other investors. So your conversions are either going to be a future financing. The real difference is whether or not it's debt, technically, or a warrant. Honestly, people get hung up on it being debt. Debt comes with slightly more protections for them. At the end of the day, if your company implodes, like, nobody's going to come take your house, right? That's the point of a corporate structure. So it's not worth arguing over. You do whatever your investors, if this person wants to give you money, you just do whichever one they want. There's different, like I said, there's different types of venture capital firms. Now, what's interesting in biotech is I broke this out on like roughly, theoretically, a seed stage fund might be only 150 million or less. AB fund might be a little bit bigger. Series C, D, crossover funds are even bigger. Those are the billion-dollar funds, except for people like Arch, which does everything from venture creation all the way through crossover rounds, and they're a multi-billion-dollar fund. So the lines are very blurred. And then some of them will have, maybe they mainly invest later, but then they start a seed stage fund, right? And I think Sante started a seed stage fund recently. So the lines can be a little blurred, and then like I said, there's those venture studios, but essentially it's worth knowing roughly where the lines are. Investors will signal this by saying we invest at founding, or we invest early stage. Early stage is usually seed A, B at the latest. We're growth, or late stage, that's C, D, crossover. There's no point in pitching to NEA, which mainly does this later stage, if you're at this stage, right? Sometimes they go in on these mega deals that are super early, but most of the time they're doing later stage, right? So unless you're raising, that's because NEA, if they're a $1 billion fund, they gotta put a bunch of money in to get enough out to make their fund math work. We're gonna talk about that. So venture funds, this is sometimes people, I think it's worth remembering. The point of this is your investors have investors. So many of the behaviors that venture capitalists get flack for can be explained by keeping in mind that they also have investors, that if they want to keep doing what they're doing, they have to show returns, and they actually have a pretty tight timeline to show returns. So your LPs are your limited partners. They're usually like an endowment. Sometimes it's these family offices. They provide capital on a first fund basis. So you go out and you raise your fund one, you manage to find a couple LPs. Then you got to do it again for a fund two, and you're hoping, that, again, just like you do, they're really hoping that their first LPs are going to fall into the second fund. Because if they don't, it's going to be a lot harder to explain to other LPs why your first LPs weren't happy with the returns that you brought them, right? And then fund three and so forth. And so they'll have, as they get going, multiple funds at a time. Each fund has a thesis. This is important to keep in mind. The thesis might shift between funds. So just because they were invested in something, if it's not part of their current fund's thesis, they actually may not even be legally allowed to invest in your project if it doesn't fit their thesis. There's a legal obligation that they have created with their LPs. Those funds are 10 years long, but they only invest for the first 3 to 4 years. So, how much capital they have, how long they still have to invest is an important question. Sometimes VCs that are still trying to raise their next fund will go out and try and like collect deals essentially, but they don't actually have a lot of what's called dry powder. They don't have a lot of capital that they can call on. They're trying to use those as examples for their next funds, that we can start the next fund with a couple deals in the bank already. That'll affect your timeline because you'll be like, oh, this is going really well, I'm ready to close, but they're still trying to close. So it's just worth keeping in mind. The way venture capitalists make money is they get a management fee, about 2% per year. That basically just keeps the office running. They actually, it's really kind of in a way a loan if they're successful, because they only make that 20% return after the return of the initial investment, including those management fees. So if it's a $100 million fund, yeah, you're pulling down 2% per year, so $2 million. But you have to return to your LPs at over $100 million before you get to start pulling what that's called carry, that 20%. So, and that's where the money is really made for them. They're benchmarked essentially against the market. So if you're a retirement fund, California Retirement Fund, Teachers Retirement Fund is a huge LP in a lot of different funds. You could just put it in stocks, and you'll pretty reliably over the course of time make 7 to 10%, right? So whatever the venture capital is way more risky. So if you're going to allocate that percentage of people's retirement money to a venture capitalist, it better be beating that market, right? Which is, at least in the US, considered to be relatively stable. So your funds, most of the time, they're targeting about 20% IRR, internal rate of return. So people talk about the return on investment because it's an easy number to calculate. Like, oh, you put in $20 million, you get it back $100 million. You made 5x, but that 5x has to be in the view of like, if it took you 20 years to make 5x, that's not a good investment, right? If you do it in a year, maybe it's a great investment as long as it brings back enough capital. So I wanted to show I want to talk about like venture math and how they view them, because you'll hear about portfolio math a lot. So here's a couple of investments. So this venture firm is currently only making 5. That would be a terrible venture firm. Normally they're aiming for like 15 to 20, but we're doing 5 because it's too many lines otherwise. $100 million fund. And so you can see here they're putting in money, like they found a couple companies, they put in a couple $1 million. So each of these early investments are pretty small, between $2 and $5 million, and then they're putting in money as they go. 3 of the companies blow up. 2 of the companies exit, right? And so you can see this one made 2.5x, and this one made 3x. That seems pretty good. If you're the entrepreneur, you're like, well, you only put in $20 million, and I got you back $60 million. Why aren't you happy? The problem is, they only actually made $40 million out of the whole fund, and their IRR was only 8%, so they're barely getting stocks. That's not good. They're probably not going to be able to raise another fund. So they still got $8 million to carry, but nobody's happy at the end of that. You don't get to do it again. You'll cry yourself all the way to the bank, though, so you don't have to feel too bad about it. So, and what's worse is they spent like the first $37 million in those first 3 years. They had no returns. That's common in biotech, so it actually a lot of times takes funds 2-3 cycles to die. So they can get through a bad cycle, but they can't get through 2 bad cycles because it starts catching up to them. So they invest, like I said. So now on this other one, this is what I'm talking about, venture math. So similar start, right? Maybe it was a little bit more conservative. They did smaller checks at the start. This guy they were pretty conservative with and blew up and they lose a lot of money, so that was great for them. This one, they thought this was going really well and maybe a clinical trial blew up. and then that was the end of that. But these other projects, right? So this one got 3x, that's okay. That's pretty decent. But this is the one that really is going to make them their money, right? So this one got them 10x. And when you hear venture capitalists talk about this, they'll say, oh, it doubled the fund, right? Because they put in 100 million, you got back 200 million, even with the losses. Now their carry is pretty substantial, right? I did not update the slide as I was playing with the numbers. The numbers are wrong, but that's okay. We'll fix it. So they actually got $145 million back. They get 20% of that. Does anyone want to do the math for me? $29 million of carry. This number I'm pretty sure is right because that was done by Excel for this bottom row. So that's okay. And they got 22% return IRR. So these guys are gonna be able to raise another fund. You know, maybe at this annual meeting, maybe it looked a little less good. They're like, hey, we just got an exit this year. Things are working, and they're pointing to this one. They don't know this one's gonna blow up yet. They're like, look, these deals are all gonna work out. We're gonna bring back so much money for you. And they were right. So that's why they typically are aiming for at least 10% on any given, they're aiming for about 10x on any given deal because they know most of them aren't gonna get that. They need at least a couple of them to get it. So what does this mean for you? Like, why do you care how venture capitalists make money? It directly affects how you get a pre-money valuation, right? Because that pre-money valuation really depends on a lot of things. Depends on the stage of your asset. Both in how much money do they have to put in and the perceived risk. How likely are they to get out? The more mature it is, the more likely you're to get out. If you have clinical data, at least you know it doesn't kill anybody if you put it in. Then you're you're flipping a coin on efficacy, but you might have some early efficacy sort of indications as well. What's the market doing right now? How much competition is it for them? Because no matter what, yeah, they're incentivized to get the best deal possible, but they're also, if it's a really good deal, they're competing with other firms for that deal. So they have to give you something that you're willing to take. How good are the exits recently? If exits are going super high, they might be willing to give you a better deal, to give you a better valuation, because to them, they just need to get deals in the pipeline. They'll count on being able to get a good exit later on. Technology changes are good and bad. If you're doing something really revolutionary, that could drive a tremendous impact. It also tends to be very expensive to prove. And so, you know, Moderna, it looks like a success right now. The flagship loves to talk about them, but they put in $400, $500 million into Moderna, and up until 2 years ago, it wasn't looking super hot. So now they always knew it was going to work, but I don't know if that's true. So, and then the team. So the team directly impacts the perceived risk and perceived potential. We're not going to talk about this as much because this is the fuzziest part to talk about, but it's one of the most important things. So who do you partner with? Is it somebody they recognize? Is it somebody that comes from a brand name, which can be good and bad for actual functional execution, but is it somebody that they think will be a good steward for their money? They're going to do diligence. They're going to look at your plan. They're going to try and understand the technology, and they're going to understand 70% of it, and they're going to trust you to a certain extent that you're being reasonable, that you're being credible, that what you're saying as an expert is real, and that the plan that you put together and the people that you're pointing to are all real, and then if and when your plan runs straight into a wall, they're going to that you will be smart enough to overcome those. And so that really plays into perceived risk. So just focusing, I mean, I gotta say, if you guys do one thing in the next 9 months, just focusing on the team, and it doesn't have to be all full-time people. Who's consulting? Who's telling you? If you say it's gonna take $20 million, how do you know that? Who's telling you that? And build out that team. They could be consultants. We're going to help you do that, right? That affects the perceived risk and can affect whether or not you're even able to make money, much less, or able to raise investment, much less at what valuation. The other thing to think about is the reason we went through the venture math exercises. This is the same company that we saw before. So this is solution. This is looking at founder value over time. Let's look at this from the venture capitalist side. So let's say you have a $150 million fund, and that sounds like a huge number, but actually if you kind of work it out, you're expecting somewhere around $20 million, at least for each company. And so you're going to lead a Series A or Series C or A round, and you're hoping for a $5 million first check. So that way you can get a little bit of progress and see how it goes, and see if these bets that you're making are working before you put in that whole $20 million. Come across a company raising $3 million seed round. You're like, okay, I can do this. I can do the whole round. Get a bigger portion. But you're expecting to follow through A and B round, but you know you're not going to be able to carry those later rounds. And you did the math. You looked at the market. You talked to your own consultants and used your own experience, and you're like, I think this company's gonna need anywhere between 150 to 180 million dollars. Then we can probably sell it or IPO it. Okay, so here's what happens. So this is again from the venture capitalist side. So they take 33% on the first cut. They get diluted, but they re-up. They put in a little bit more money. So they followed on. They ended up at roughly the same percentage holding, so 34%. They put in another $10 million at Series B. Again, they got diluted, but they added on. And so they're at 31%, but now they can't fall anymore. They put in their 20 million. That's kind of it. They got to sort of write it out. So they can actually, they're going to be an advocate for you as you go into the Series C round, because they don't want to get crushed by those people, right? So they're going to keep you from agreeing to certain terms potentially, because they're incentivized to make sure they don't get to do too much. So they're going to help you get a better valuation. Follow you on, and then you IPO. You do another round. You raise $100 million, and you're basically looking at it's basically a crossover, and you IPO. They get 9.3x out of it. That's not bad. But they had to maintain, even though they had this chunk, they had to maintain over time. And what they're looking for is how much of the company do they want to own at the end versus how much money do they think you're going to have to get. And that can affect your valuation as well. Does that make sense, everybody? I don't want to just get on a roll here. I don't want everybody to glaze over either. So your venture map tries your fundraising potential. This is why one of the things we're going to emphasize with you is how much money do you really need to get to where you need to go, not just for this round, but for the next round, right? And the round after that, hopefully. So having some ideas and focusing your vision, because if you're just like, we're going to start 5 products, we're going to try and advance 5 different products, but we're only raising $20 million, that doesn't work out. We're like, you're going to need a lot more money than that. Also, it signals that you don't actually know what it's going to take. So you're sort of signaling to me that you're less sophisticated. So, and then build this team. These decisions are so important. I will tell you, and I can't emphasize enough. Who you partner with is you need a partner. Sometimes it's like, who's excited? Who are you excited to work with? But it's also really important. That's why you have those vesting provisions, because that person can do a lot of damage to an early stage company. I've seen it. I've lived it. It's tragic. There's nothing worse than being in the room where you try to tell somebody, hey, I don't think that's the right number. And they say it to a VC, and that VC says, I quote, never say that you need that little money again. That's a very unpleasant experience. So don't do that. So when you're thinking about your VCs, let's say there's 39,000 VCs in the world. Just pull that off with PitchBook. Couldn't find an exact number for the life science VCs, but it's a lot less. So closest I could find based on deal format, it seems somewhere around 5,000. Maybe only 1,500 of those life science VCs will do biotech. Maybe you fit the thesis of about a third of them. Cancer is a really popular investing category, so that's helpful. But there's also a lot of competition. Maybe only half of those are really actively looking for deals right now, and then you gotta figure out who can you actually reach and talk to and engage with in a meaningful way. So your world really shrinks, and so having a strategy around this, how are you gonna get connected to people? Who are you going to talk to? Always having conversations, because you never know how it's going to feed forward. Really important. And then when you talk to them, you'll notice that most of the VCs, and you should be listening when they do this, they'll have a little spiel at the beginning when they introduce their firm. And they'll say, we an X dollar fund, we just closed our fund, blah, blah, blah. And you can do the math on how many years ago that was. We'd like to write our first check of X million dollars. Sometimes they'll tell you the company at lifetime allocation, and you certainly should feel able to ask later on if you get that far. And sometimes they'll tell you if they lead rounds, or you should ask, right? Because whoever leads the round sets the terms for the round for all the investors. So that's sort of just understanding. I just wanted to go through all that from the VC perspective, so that way you guys understand, because we're going to talk about a little bit more. How that feeds forward to term sheets, and then also the fundraising, making sure that you understand why they're incentivized that way to do the things they do. Any comments, questions? Are we running out of steam here?
Maybe you'll cover this, but are there databases available that allow you to do that sort?
Yes. So that's part of why we did the deal format. So the easiest way to do it, some firms publish their theses, some don't, right? But the easiest way to look at it is who's doing deals in the space, who's investing in not your direct competitors, but in roughly your space. It is worth knowing if they invest in your direct competitors, because they're not gonna invest in you, but they might take the phone call to see if what you're doing is better than what they already invested in. So, so we have like Deal Former, for example. We can help you pull those, looking for people who are investing in your space. We're piloting PitchBook right now. We have CB Insights. So there's a couple different ones. Each of these databases has advantages. Each of them has limitations. And so you kind of want to create an amalgam. You'll never have a perfect picture, but you can start to sort that way. The trickier part, honestly, for being in Houston is getting access to these firms, right? There are firms who spend quite a bit of time out here looking for deals, like IBM. A lot of them don't. I think a lot of them underappreciate this ecosystem. So having the right partner who does have connections to those firms, we have some connections to some of those firms, right? Going to things like JP Morgan and using that as a way to connect, or even ACR. Some of them will go to ACR looking for these early stage projects. Can be a good way to bring visibility and start those conversations. And usually what you're going to do is you have some plucky associate come up to your poster ACR and start asking a lot of questions or whatever, and you'll notice that they might be associated with a firm. And that's a good way to start that conversation, and you certainly should not. So an associate's not the partner, they don't make the final investing decisions, they're working for the partners. But they're what's bringing a lot of deal flow, and they're the ones actually doing the diligence. So take the time to talk to them and be nice to them. Because they'll have a huge impact on whether or not you get funded. So, any other questions? Okay, I want to make sure we get through this. How long is the next section? So here's what I'm going to suggest. If you guys will bear with me we're going to try and crank through the next section in about 20-ish minutes, just talking about some of the terms that you'll see on a term sheet. We'll get through all the boring definition stuff, and we'll come back and we'll have a conversation about like fundraising a little bit. So after a break. So term sheets. So I'm going to tell you things that are way less detailed and robust than this book. This book is the book you should read. It's the book that venture capitalists read. It's the book that entrepreneurs read. Everybody should read this book. It talks a lot about, from a tech perspective, but the term sheet part, the terms are all basically the same, right? And it's very clear English. I like reading contracts, so I thought it was a super interesting book. One of the people I recommended to last year said, oh yeah, I got about halfway through and I kept falling asleep. So, I don't know, your mileage may vary, but it'll tell you everything you need to know. It also talks about things just like boards and strategy and fundraising and how do you talk to venture investors. So preferred stock, I think we've talked about a little bit. The preferred stock is what you give investors. It's a separate class of shares, senior to the common stock, and has a bunch of rights associated with it, which we're going to talk about. And the fundamental things that go on in a financing round, which will be defined in the term sheet, is economics and control. So you're negotiating over both, and you need to understand the implications of both. So the economics are the part I think people really focus on first, because it's like, what value are you giving me? But the controls the fate of your company, and again, they can do things like force the sale of your company, or block your next fundraising round if they don't like the terms. So you need to really trust the partners that you are signing up with. The terms I'm going to show you are from the NVCA. They have a whole bunch of model documents. They have model incorporation documents. They have model term sheets in this case, non-disclosure agreements, a bunch of other stuff. That's all like the standard. Their versions are a little bit heavier on legalese than some of the ones I've seen, but it's good. Right? So we're going to use that. So the first thing that you'll notice usually at the top is the price. Right? The price is really easy. They get equity. The share price is essentially set based on how many shares exist, right? And what percentage they're going to end up with. But the percentage is defined as how many dollars are raised, the pre-money valuation, over your pre-money valuation plus the amount of money you raised. So your final value. So option pools, you're making a new option pool as a term of your investment. So let's say you have an option pool, you've given away some of it. your investor says, okay, go into the next round, we think you need a 15% option pool, that all gets allocated prior to their investment, so you have 15% post-investment, so you want it to be 20% or whatever math works out to be. So that squashes you, and then you get squashed again, so it's worth keeping in mind. There's not a lot to be done about it, that's just the way it is. But, you know, keep it in mind.
So the pre-money evaluation is really what most people negotiate around on the
Yeah.
price.
Yeah. The pre-money evaluation is like, how much is your company worth today? The funny thing about it is it's kind of a made-up number, because let's say you have a preclinical product. So like, George, to your point earlier, let's say you have a preclinical product, and they say your company's worth $10 million, because that's, you know, based on the alignment and comparable deals and whatever, that's the valuation that people at your stage and technology class and what have you are getting, region. If somehow you did sell that to pharma, it's probably worth a lot more, but you don't have anybody else to sell it to, so it's actually worth a lot less. So it's kind of a made-up number, but it's a really important made-up number, so it's the number that dictates how much of your company you're giving away when you raise money. But it's worth giving you money, it's like simultaneously a lot more and a lot less, and I don't know what the right answer is, right? So, this is a really important term though. So the liquidation preferences say that preferred stockholders always get their money out first. So if you do a salvage sale, whoever is a preferred stockholder gets their money out first. Senior classes, i.e. most recent investors, get their money out first. And then it goes down from there. So, because they get to set the terms, because they were the most recent money in, and you needed their money too. So, that's why it works that way. So this is a lot of legalese, but we're gonna talk about this in a little bit more detail. So the first one is called, and this is just legal language, so you have it for later. Non-participating preferred. So, and then you have participating preferred. So non-participating preferred versus participating preferred dictates like when they get their money out first, how do they get to continue to participate in the distributions from the proceeds of the sale? And then there's a cap, there's a middle ground. So non-participating preferred says, if you sell the company, you pay the investor first, and then you distribute the remaining to common only, according to their relative ownership. So this is the most founder-friendly version. So let's say it's a 1x liquidation preference, which is typical. Your investor has 20%, you have 40, your founder 1 has 40, founder 2 has 20, the other common is 20. There's only been one round of financing, it's a happy early sale. So what you'll notice is that $10 million, if you sell the company for $10 million, investor gets their money out. They're not thrilled, but at least they got their money back. And you don't get anything. Better luck next time. You sell the company for $20 million, investor gets their $10 million out. Founder 1 owns relative to the other common shareholders 50%, right? So they get 5 and the others get 2.5 each. Yeah, it's not bad. Buy a nice house. A little boat. It's not great. It's not bad. If you exit for $50 million, sort of same thing happens. Now something interesting happens after 50. You'll notice all of a sudden the investor's getting more money again. That's because they'll do something that's called convert their shares. So at the moment of the sale, again, they'll be able to convert their shares into common stock, and they don't have to worry about this liquidation preference anymore. So they're no longer capped. So at over a certain price range, they'll say, yep, that's what we're going to do. We're going to take our $40 million instead of $10 million, and it's just, and at that point, it's just whatever the equity holdings are. Does that make sense to everybody? Full participating is a little different because they still get their money out first, and then they get to participate in the additional distributions. So full participating, same thing happens, but now as you get past that $10 million, you'll notice they got a little bit of money here. Here, and here, and here. And actually it never changes. It's just that same trajectory forever. And that's because they get to continue to participate. So they take their $10 million out, and then everybody gets a distribution according to their shareholdings. They actually don't ever need to convert. So this is the most investor friendly. Also, 1x is typical in bad economic times. Sometimes you'll see liquidation preferences go up to 3x. Saying that they have to at least get 3 times their money back, and that's the price of the risk that they're taking. Now, at the $200 million exit or more, right, it kind of doesn't matter, right? Like if you look at 40 million, 48 million, like it's a few million, I mean, again, it's a lot of money, but like you've already made a lot of money, so it's like, you'll be very upset about it as you take it to the bank and go buy a new house and do whatever you're gonna do, right? Get a boat, name it TMC Act as a tribute to the help that you've received here. The USS Sarah. So, this is the middle ground. So what this says is there's a participation cap. So they still get their 1x back, and then they can participate just like before in the distributions. But once they hit $30 million in this case, that's their cap on how much they can continue to participate. So what you'll see is, should change this to $110 million, it would have changed a little bit better. So $110 million, that it would hit that $30 million disbursement. It's no longer worth them staying as preferred stock. If you sell for more than $110 million, they're gonna go ahead and convert and everything will be completely even. So that says, look, that helps them can get a little bit better upside up until they make that 3x minimum. This is an okay middle ground. This is fine. Honestly, any of them are fine. Your ability to negotiate these terms depends on how many term sheets you get. But it's just worth understanding how this affects the math on the other side of a company. And you do hear about sometimes people being very upset that they did what's called a salvage sale a lot of times. Sold the company not for a lot, they're like, I didn't get anything. We sold it for $200 million and I didn't get anything. It's because they raised $150 million or whatever. And you know, by the time you get through these liquidation preferences of the different series, it's just, there's not a lot left over, right? So even though it sounds like a lot of money, the investors still have to get their money back first. They don't fully understand.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So does that mean for startups that you have some investors that can be a friends or even founder can be daily investors, early investors?
Yeah,
so
they can be. So yeah.
So that, you know, once whatever options comes up.
So you do those as notes. Just do them as notes. Don't try and do a price round with friends and family. So this is what's called price round. So you set a value. It's a venture capital led round. Family, friends, angel investors, anything that's like super early stage. You do it as a convertible note typically, so they get that 20% discount. There might be a valuation cap, there might not be. Usually there is. You don't have to worry about any of this. Actually, in the convertible note, it will say that if the company collapses, they get their money out first. They get their debt because it's a debt vehicle. I think a SAFE doesn't necessarily have that. I don't know of any investors around here who like doing SAFE, so it's not worth worrying about. But just always pay your investors back first, or soon you will have to.
But you really don't, if you can help it, you don't want to have anything over 1x on the...
Yeah. Right now, current climate, maybe the cap or whatever, if they're driving a really hard bargain, the cap should not be more than 1x in the current climate. Like 2008, there's some worse ones I hear. I don't know. I wasn't raising money then, so it didn't matter. Unfortunate for those people, I guess. So, voting rights. There's a lot of legalese to tell you a couple things that are really, really important when you raise venture capital. The percentage they hold has nothing to do with control of the company, right? They could be a minority shareholder, but maybe they only have 20%. Heck, maybe they only have 10%. Typically, for every price round, this is a big difference with the convertible notes because this does not occur with a note, right? Because it's just a debt vehicle. They will get to elect members of the board of directors. It's at least, the convention is at least one per price round. Sometimes it'll dictate that they get to do an independent independent director, or maybe there'll be two, they get 2 board seats if it's a very early stage company and they think that you're gonna need their leadership, right? So if they want more control, they'll put it as part of the terms and it'll be here. So as long as they're a shareholder of preferred stock, they get to elect a board member. It'll usually be 1 per round, so even if you have several investors, they'll just pick one to be the lead. Whoever's the lead will take the board seat. And then on top of that, so the board of directors hires and fires the CEO. They get to make a lot of major financial decisions, including approving new shareholder stock issuances and accepting fundraising terms or sales terms. They also have these protective provisions. So even if Regardless, they'll also have these provisions that say you cannot, without their consent, at least to that class of shares, the Series A in this case, sell the company, right? Or close the company, right? Issue securities, sell tokens, ban a few things I think is crazy, but it's funny that it's in there now. Dividends, change major equity compensation plans, right? Like the executives. Create debt, create subsidiaries, increase or decrease the board of directors. Do anything that changes the fundamental financials of the company, of what they're investing in. So the sales one is really important because you might have an offer. So if you go back to here, let's say you have an offer, you're happy with this. Like $2 million, that's not bad. I've only been working on it for a year or so. I'm okay with that. Nah. They're like, look, we're not getting enough money out. We think there's plenty of potential. If they don't think there's potential and they agree with you, sure, they'll let you sell the company. They're like, look, you cannot give up right now. In fact, because you're suggesting that, maybe we should be finding a different CEO because I don't think you have the commitment to make this through. We're not accepting that deal. This is not enough money because we need to get our returns. So absolutely not. You cannot sell the company. And how could you suggest that, right? So it's really important just to keep that in mind. But you give up a substantial amount of control. So again, the longer you go earlier, without doing that, the more control you have, the better valuation you have, right? There's mechanisms to do that. It tends to be slower, but it can be very profitable. It's just things to think about as you're making these deals. They also have a bunch of other conversion notes. The conversions, what I'm talking about, they always have the right to but not the obligation to turn into common stock. If you all set a price and then your future you have to raise more money and you realize that you mispriced the round, you have to raise money at a lower valuation than you did this one, they'll get anti-dilution. It can be anything from completely repricing their shares to some shared responsibility essentially of a discount. But just be aware, you never want to do what's called a down round. It's painful. Nobody's happy. Might dictate that you have a certain option pool so you can continue to hire people. If you haven't already, which you should, it will ensure that you have non-compete, non-disclosure agreements with all the key personnel and employees. This is important actually because as a scientist, you're going to be working on multiple projects that are probably semi-related. And nobody wants to give you a bunch of money and then have you start another competing company against the company they just funded. So be enthusiastic that you should not be, make your bet, don't try and spread your technologies too thin, and be an enthusiastic supporter of it. Don't ask people to put a bunch of money in and then try and start a competing company. Unless you're like George Church, but even then, they're not all exactly the same. He gets to do it because he's George Church. Nobody else gets to do that. They want to, if it's going well, they want to be able to participate in the next round. That's all that says. Essentially, another firm can't come in and lock them out from being able to top up, like I was showing. And if they don't, this is actually one, it's not very common in the first round of financing, but will show up later, or in a syndicate financing, essentially saying, if you don't keep funding this, you don't get to be preferred stock anymore. You get converted. You still get your stock, but it's now common stock. You don't get all those rights. So this is a way, actually investors use this to incentivize each other. If they put a syndicate together, they want to ensure that this syndicate's going to hang together. If they put more money in, they all share the responsibility for that. And so they enforce that by saying, hey, you gotta stick with this if you're still believing it, or we're all going to decide together to give up on it. And then no shop. Once you sign in a term sheet, also just don't. Don't shop it around. Don't behave well. These are your partners. They're going to be with you for a long time. So once you've made an agreement, you're with it. The point of the term sheet, this is not a definitive document. So it can be anywhere from like a couple pages to 15 pages. It'll feel like a definitive document, but it's not. Because the lawyers have to get involved and your final documents are going to be like 100 pages or so. The point is it gives you a short, simpler document to start negotiating around. Make sure everybody's on the same page. Make sure you understand what you're talking about pre-money versus post-money valuation, how much equity are we really giving away, have we agreed on board seats, things like that. So that's the point of it, and then drafting those documents are very expensive and time-consuming and what have you. So That's the point of that. So that's it. I just want to get through that, and we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll have a quicker discussion about fundraising. So, any comments, questions? George.
Thank you, Sarah. So I think it's good if maybe you can prepare a slide to tell us where exactly PMC can help us at specific ideas. And what are the people from your team that you can rely and all? Because everything is very complicated. How can we rely on you?
So.
George, you rely on yourself.
No, I mean, that's a fair question. So, having a lawyer, so we're not lawyers.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give you legal advice ever. I will give you perspective. So if you guys ever want advice, I'm like, hey, somebody tell me this. Does that sound right? Or what do you think about it? I'll tell you my perspective. I'll tell you what I think about it. But it's not my decision at the end of the day, right? Unless we're starting a company together or something, right? Like it's not up to me, right? So it's really up to whoever, again, this comes back to like what is fair. So we're all here to help, I've seen term sheets, I've been part of these negotiations, Tom's been part of these negotiations, right? Enrique's, done some of this stuff, so we can give perspective, but we can't make the final decision for you. Where else you can rely on us though, and I should think is as or more important is reputation. So if let's say Sante wants to give you money, right? I'll tell you, I think Sante is a great firm, right? Sante is a fantastic firm, very reputable. I've never heard anybody say that they've treated their entrepreneurs unfairly or squashed them or whatever. They drive a hard bargain, but any good firm does, right? So, we can give you advice on that, and our experiences with them, or what the relationships we have with different partners, for example. But we can't tell you what the right choice is. It's something way out of line. We actually did have one last year though, where there was an inventor who super early, and there was a firm they were trying to offer what looked like a venture development sort of deal. The technology was so early, and he was obligating himself to work with them and giving away such a huge portion of the company, right? But my opinion was, hey, you could do this as an SBIR if you really want to go as a company, or you could write another grant, because that's the stage you're at. And maybe it's not worth it right now to have all these obligations. But at the end of the day, the decision was up to him. So
I mean, I guess I agree with Dr. Kelly. So I guess it will be more clear if you say that, on what aspect the PMC can help us, how to connect with venture capitalists to provide diluted fund, or provide the suggestion on writing SBIR grant application, or provide any suggestions on the business plan, and this different perspective of.
So we do all of that, right? So I can't say I know all the firms, but we know quite a few that we bring in. We will connect you. We'll have some people here for Summit. See what COVID does for us for in-person attendance on Summit. Last year, we had some people here at Summit. We had some people we were connecting afterwards, right? Stage appropriate. We did some earlier, and I've said this already to a couple people. We're going to talk about strategy here after our break. I think that was a mistake for some of them because they weren't fully ready. And then the firms felt like they had seen it. So we will connect you to venture. We will also, and if it wasn't clear or not clear yet, we do paid grant writing support for CPRIT and or SBIR, right? And we're going to help you figure out where you're most likely to be successful. We're going to help you think about what the plan should be. What should you be writing into that? That's part of the reason with SAS. We had some conversations yesterday already, at least with what ones I was sitting in with, like, maybe your SBIR should be, you're kind of focused on this, but actually, here's what I think would add a ton of value for your ability to raise venture, right? So maybe we should be doing that, right, instead. And like, again, at the end of the day, it's like, I'm not writing the grant for you, but I'll tell you what I think you should put in the grant, because and we're doing that as a group, and we're bringing in advisors, right? So, I mean, I can put together a slide that says that, but I'm just telling you right now, that's what it is, right? And then what was the other thing you asked for, like, so grants, venture, strategic advice with the EIRs, that's what we're here for, right? Again, we're trying to connect you to advisors, so part of the reason for SAS is we're trying to hear the questions you're asking, also hearing the questions that are being asked. We're gonna regroup with all of you after, we're gonna say, hey, look, these are the challenges, like, here's what we had thought coming in, right? For all of you, I'll promise you, we have things we think that are, like, potential challenges coming up. It's not, like, if it doesn't have potential challenges, it's not an early stage project, so, right? So, like, there's things that we're like, hey, this could be a real issue for you. This is what we're going to try and get ahead of. Here's the kinds of people we want to start thinking about talking to. We're going to have a conversation with you. It's not just us. Like, we're like, do you know some people? Because sometimes you guys know more people than you think, right? And helping you be like, hey, you should engage with this person too, right? And pull this person in. Or, hey, we have a consultant that'll help you figure out manufacturing. Or whatever, right? Let's get ahead of that. Let's put that plan together. So we're bringing our strategic experience, but we're not experts in every aspect of drug development. We're trying to put together the right team with you. So, does that make sense? And it's not an obligation, right? You can work with us through the whole thing and then network with us over again, or you can continue working with us. It's up to you. Okay. Ashley's glaring at me because we're supposed to have taken a break already.
That's okay.
So we're gonna take a break and then we're gonna get through the last part, and then if we don't finish our discussion on the last part, we will come back on Thursday morning on it too. So, 10 minutes. With my caveat of, it's my opinions, my experiences, but people have different opinions. They have different resources too. And so it's, how you get money into the company is a search more than it is a definitive plan. And it depends on the technology, depends on you, depends on the time you're putting in, who you're partnered with, everything. You are, as a general rule though, going to be an integral part of this early stage process. For early rounds especially, you'll probably be part of those pitch meetings. If you're a co-founder to the company who's involved at any level, because you understand the science better in the earliest stages. The science is one of the major thresholds. The other thing I want to say is work with your institution to ensure that everything is filed, right, properly, fully covered. Work with your lawyers, understand all that, and then don't be too precious with your data, right? You can really shoot yourself in the foot when you're talking about a technology that's fundamentally technical and you're trying to understand the science by not sharing enough detail to help people understand why it's exciting. Don't overwhelm them with data either. You're not proving a thesis. You're trying to show the parts that are exciting and stand out, not proving every point. But don't ask investors for NDAs on first meetings. They're not going to do it. And it'll just ignore them. So fundamentally what we're trying to do is give enough information to tell a story. And the story will evolve. I don't do this right the first time. You won't do it right the first time. This is an evolving story that will depend as you continue to build and plan and hear feedback and realize what people aren't understanding or what they're getting hung up on, and you need to emphasize a little bit more. But the structure of the story is fundamentally, what are you doing? Why should you be the one doing it? There's lots of other smart people in the world. Never assume that there's not other smart people in the world, so why haven't they done it? Why are you different? Right? What are you doing that's different? How many people are you going to help? But don't, if it's a drug, most of the time over a certain threshold, heck, even orphan drugs right now are getting funded pretty well because you just raised the price of them, right? So how many people is important, but not as important as what are their other options? Will they actually use this, right? Because if it's a drug, most of the time, if it's the only option, they're going to use it, and somebody will pay for it. Who else has tried and failed to solve this? This is a really challenging one sometimes because you're looking for dead bodies on the ground that might be difficult to find and not publications, right? If you're not super involved in the biotech, news or whatever, maybe you don't see as much or you don't know the history. So this is where your mentors and advisors can be super useful. It's just letting you know about things that you didn't know about. What resources and people have you gathered? Is it just you that thinks this is a good idea, or do other people think this is a good idea? Even better if they're outside your institution, because everybody knows that you put two scientists in a room, a lot of times they're not going to agree on something. So if you can get them to both agree that this is a great idea, then maybe there's something here, right? They're real experts in their field. And then what do you actually need? And that part's actually really overlooked sometimes. What do you really need? And what are you really going to do with it? And how's that really going to add value? And I think that's really the key. At least in my experience, that's the key at this early stage. Maybe later on you have a little bit of fuzzier number. $40 million sounds like a great number, and that's what we decided to raise. Right now, what we need to figure out is what are you really asking for, and why. And this sounds like a really pedantic question, because I'm asking for money to get the IND. I have all these regulatory steps. I gotta go make drug, right? But you're not asking for money all the way to get the IND. Even if you're asking for $20 million, they're not gonna give you $20 million out once. They're gonna give you a few $1 million, right? And then they'll give you the rest later. So you need to understand, what are you doing with the first few $1 million? Getting that right is actually a trick. And that's part of what you're doing in this process of getting feedback. Is you're trying to figure out what is the right goals, what is the right milestones. And so we can talk about this. I'm going to talk about this real quick, and then we're going to have maybe a longer discussion about it. This is my process. Again, it seems relatively simple, but it's really a critical process before you even think about starting to fundraise. So what are your goals? What are you doing at each stage, right? About how much money can you typically raise, although these numbers are highly variable in today's market, but let's just put these as benchmarks. And what are your overall goals for that stage? So seed stage, which is where most of us are at right now, trying to get a license. You're trying to get enough of a team or enough momentum or enough of a plan to convince your licensing office to give you a license, because otherwise they're not going to give you one. They don't think you know what to do with it. You're starting to recruit executives. You're starting to talk to your collaborators and maybe form a formal SAB. You're validating your experiments if you can, because that can be really critical in getting key outsourced data. And essentially, like, a lot of people just call this like the walking around line. You're just trying to get going, right? You're not really trying to get the IND right now. You're just trying to get a structure to know how to get the IND. After that, it becomes a little bit simpler, but not easier. Let's put it that way. So you take all that information, you start talking to people. My goal, my strategy, not everybody has this strategy, is talk to as many people as I can, particularly people I trust. So I have a group of people I go talk to. They're like, is this a good idea? I don't know. I think it's a good idea. Is it a good idea? And you start and like, hey, I think this could be a problem. I'm gonna work with this consultant for a few hours and figure out if it's really a problem. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's not that big a problem. Like, actually, that's not as big a deal as you think it is. Or, hey, we had this happen last year with one of our companies. I thought regulatory was going to be a huge issue for them because they had a complex biologic. And what they actually found out was, not only was that not as big of a problem as I thought it was going to be, right? But the consultant that we had, the tox consultant, who's super expert, she's from like Pfizer originally, she said, actually, if you just change your dosing route, not only are you going to help this potential issue on a regulatory path, but it's going to be way easier for dosing, which is going to make clinicians like it better, which makes patient adherence like it better. And so I think overall it's going to make this a much stronger story. You kind of kill two birds with one stone just by talking to people sometimes. And that's part of why we have these consultants as part of the program. So you can just get as much detail as possible, knowing that it's kind of guesses at this stage, right? You're putting together a plan knowing it's going to be wrong, but it's better than no plan at all. And then you start to take that plan and you go out and you get some quotes. Part of the reason I set up a corporate structure sooner than later is so you can get quotes that are actual quotes and not guesses. Because they want it to be attached to something, there'll be NDAs, etc. associated with it. These are rough numbers that I plugged into different things. The ranges kind of depend on what you're doing, where you're doing it, etc. R&D is a lot more expensive than you're used to. Don't forget that. That's a big one. Those mouse experiments are like $40,000 each, right? So really think before you send out a mouse experiment. But it can be really valuable because it's something you didn't do, right? So that's really powerful to point to. Manufacturing is a couple-year process. As a general rule, it can be anywhere from $3 to $5 million for a small molecule. 7 to 10 is not crazy for an antibody. For cell therapy, it's just a whole other thing because it's really because it doesn't it doesn't scale as easily. You're kind of paying on a per patient basis sometimes, at least current technologies. Tox packages, a couple $1 million easily. Prices have gone up. Corporate, these are some rough numbers. Honestly, corporate's nice because you can hide some buffer for your budget in the corporate. So I like to buffer lots of money for legal because legal is always more expensive than you think it is. So nobody argues with it. So you can have a little slack in the budget. If you use less, then that's awesome, right? So I like to put things in there. And then personnel. it's worth just budgeting to pay people well. It's more than you think it should be, probably. Seed stage or not, paying industry rates as a general rule. But, you know, just plan your long-term budget with well, and if you do less, then that's great. You know, personnel costs a little less here in Houston or in Texas in general, because we don't have state income tax and it's not California. But, you know, plug in the good numbers. Plan to get great people, right? Nobody's ever going to argue with a plan where you're like, I'm going to go hire the best people I can. They might ask you to come with a smaller budget anyway, but we'll work on that. And then the milestones. And the milestones are different than the goals. So the milestones are what's stopping you from doing the bigger race, right? And that's your number one priority. Within that, you're going to have other goals that are the things you have to get done just to advance the project. So like manufacturing something that you genuinely have to get done. But really, for a seed stage, just proving that it's manufacturable is viewed as a bigger risk than you think. It's super scientifically boring. Take advantage of those courses from the GCC. I don't know if you guys noticed, they had early preliminary manufacturing stuff within there that to produce product to do those tox studies. But it's gonna be anything that adds value. So the way I think about it, so what are the 2 or 3 challenges that are keeping, if I'm raising a Series C, what are the 2 or 3 things that are keeping me from raising a Series A? And if I'm raising a Series A, what are the 2 or 3 things that are keeping me from getting a Series B, right? And you really wanna think at least a couple rounds out to ensure that you're gonna be on the right path and that your timelines are gonna align to what you think they should. So, these are some ones I wanna focus mostly over here because we're a little short on time. These are things I like to think about. Additional efficacy or validation. Actually, most of the time on these early stage projects, you've done efficacy, but maybe what you haven't done is take a really hard look at the other products that are in the market that are similar to yours. If it's a small molecule, you buy them, make them. It's an antibody, you can probably make them as well. You hold for the patents, you make them, and you run them in your assays, and you see if they're actually better. Because you think you're better, scientifically, or else hopefully you would be doing this. But it's better when you can show it, right? So if you just show head-to-head in a study, you're better, that will make a lot of questions go away. So that's competitive comparisons, maybe some additional models. Any optimization work you're doing is sort of in the seed stage. You should hopefully have, I mean, all of you I think mostly have a lead, but maybe you're doing some additional optimization. Early talks, people get really focused on the GLP package and like, oh, it takes $2 million. It's like, it does not take $2 million to stick this in a mouse, dose it up, and see if it kills the mouse. And pull the liver, pull some tissues, and look at it on the histology. That you could do in a month with an enthusiastic postdoc, right? And then early manufacturing, that's, you know, maybe if it's a protein, don't use a tagged version. Just start to get an idea of what it's going to take to make this. Because the manufacturing is actually a bigger stumbling block than you think, so that'll be one that comes up a lot. a lot. So those are milestones that are common. The specifics of it are going to be dependent on what your specific technology is. But it's whatever your biggest challenge is, and the rest of it becomes just the things that you have to get done to progress your timeline. And at the C stage, maybe you're not even worrying about that. Once you get through fundraising, so if you get to an investor and you start to have good conversations, you'll end up in something called due diligence. This is where people get really tripped up. So by the time you're in due diligence, they probably mostly believe that your technology works. And now they're really checking the management. Are all these people that you say are involved, are they involved as you say? Do you have actual scientific advisory agreements with all these advisors that you're saying that are on your slide? Your technology is, now we're gonna get into all of your experiments and really prove it out. And by we mean the associates at the firm for the most part. But they're gonna go through all your data, make sure it checks out, really do a deeper dive on competition. Competition's a really hard one at this stage because they're seeing stuff that you don't know exists, right? And you can look through patents. Patents are way more reliable than publications for finding other technologies. Watching press releases is a good way to kind of get an idea of what people are working on, but it's hard. Sometimes I figured out that there's competition I didn't know about because of the kinds of questions I was getting. Talking to an investor, I think something's really new, and they're like asking very detailed questions that are very specific on the technology, and I'm like, I know you're a pretty sophisticated investor, but these are questions questions that you would only be asking if you spent a considerable amount of time thinking about this. And that's how you figure out somebody else is working on something that's very similar to yours, to your technology. So, competition, or sometimes they'll trip you up, like, how are you better than X, Y, and Z? And you're trying to pretend that you know who X, Y, and Z is. Which you should always know. And so those first few meetings, don't pick your best investors for the first few meetings, because you'll figure out what you missed, and then you'll go back and you'll be a little smarter next time, hopefully. IP filings are another huge place people get tripped up. So remember way back at the beginning, 3 hours ago, when I said the technology transfer office is your first opportunity to be an advocate for your technology. Read the patent that your university is filing for you. Don't assume it's comprehensive. It's really boring. I don't even like reading patents. It's really boring. It's all in legalese, but read the patent, really understand what it's covering. If they're not fully specifying something or claiming it, try to understand or work with the lawyers and be like, hey, actually this technology can be applied to, I know what my disclosure had said it was going to be cancer, but actually it can be applied to autoimmune diseases as well. And we should be claiming that. Make sure that this is as comprehensive as you can make it. And if it's not, when you get it out into a company, what you're doing is you're working with lawyers, and one of the first things a lot of times you're doing is filing some additional patents, right? So this is really important, and this is you have to have this. You can't really get venture funding without a license, because otherwise what are they funding, right? So you at least need an option to license, or have that conversation progress to a point to where you're credible, so as you get close, you can start to execute that. Financials, it's a little fuzzy early on, but you know, where are you spending money, how do you spend money, where do you plan to spend money? And then your corporate. All those legal filings, the reason we went through all those terms is those have to be done right, and if they're not done right, it can cause a headache. If your cap table's not right, people will not invest, right? They'll say, I'm sorry, this isn't incentivized, come back when you cleaned it. There is ways to fix it. You can recapitalize, essentially just issue a bunch of more shares that you can do things out, right? It is fixable, but it is difficult and expensive, and nobody's happy when there's a recapitalization, and so they don't always want to do it. There's other deals, right? So getting that right from the get-go is important. Asking advice from a good lawyer, or even other people who are doing this at the same stage as you are, like in this cohort, really valuable. So yeah, this is the last slide, because I want to leave a little time, and then we're actually gonna have an opportunity on Thursday. We're gonna be regrouping, and I want you guys to think about, if you do have questions coming out of this, what they could be, and we're gonna have a panel discussion, so it's not just my opinions. We're gonna have a really nice discussion about other people who have started companies at this stage. But these are the common pitfalls that I was thinking of as I was putting this together, that I wanted us to have a conversation around, which is the right team. I know I've said this a bunch of times, and the thing I've given the least advice on, because it's the hardest part, and it's the one that's most situational. But getting the right team in place is so important. Cap table. Underappreciating the work that other people in your field are doing, and the implications that has, right, in respect to yours, and differentiating versus that. You know, Courier was a cytokine therapeutic. We were ahead of everybody else that was doing it when we started. And then a bunch of people that were big firms dumped a bunch of money into the space. And now there's still companies in this space getting funded. All on IL-2. I don't know how they're still doing it, to be honest. So not that different. But figuring out how we were telling our story, so we didn't have to get super technical to talk about why our technology, the way we were targeting it, was different and better, we thought, still think. But not, but really appreciating the value of what those other people doing. There's also smart people doing it, and why that was perceived, and figuring out how we differentiate was so critical to us being successful. Show data. Don't not show data. You do need, until you get the license, you need to be working with your TTO to make sure that what you're showing really is covered, that it hasn't been filed, and that everything's okay. That can be slow, so do it sooner than later. Get those slides together and try to get them approved sooner than later. IP filings are important. And then the rest of this is corporate, right? The budget based on what you should raise versus a really well-defined plan is so important. So I've talked to some people I should raise $20 million because that's what an antibody takes to get to IND or to get to phase 1 trials. Well, that's true, but you still need to figure out what your actual milestones are in there and how long it's going to take with detail. It's going to be a lot the same as everybody else, except for where it's not, and it's the except for where it's not that's really important to that conversation. Everybody needs to be tied side of the company. Oh, investors, after your first set of investors, this is why your investors are so important, the first set. Not only are they helping you fundraise, the terms for your first round are generally the best terms as far as like all those legal obligations and protections, and they only get worse than that, right? So if your investor comes in with super onerous terms, you're never going to get better than that, because if you have liquidation preferences that are wrong or control terms that are wrong or whatever, everybody else is going to want that too. Why not? You already gave it to the first investor. Why would they take less than that? You need the most recent money the most, right? So getting the right terms, this is probably why sophisticated investors are better too, is they actually understand what is right for market, right? So yeah, and then fundamentally this is, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, I think this is really the discussion part. Trying to fundraise before you're ready. So I said this a little bit earlier, which is those early investor meetings are interesting because in one sense, you're trying to get feedback, right? You're trying to get a sense of, is this venture fundable? And so your instinct is to go out and try and talk to as many venture capitalists as you can as quickly as possible. I will tell you from experience, there's some real flaws to that, because if you go out and you talk to the big firms right away and you're not really at the right stage, you're not the right readiness for them to give you money and be sophisticated, they won't feel like they've seen your technology before, and they're not going to engage as well the next time. They'll say they will, but most of the time no, right? Most of the time they've seen it because they're getting so many deals all the time. It's not like they're being jerks, it's not like they're not intending to follow up with you, they're just seeing so much stuff, and we all get bored with things, it's not new anymore, right? So don't use those conversations too early. We're going to tell you, you're probably going to annoy at me at some point, right? I'll be like, I need to go get X, Y, Z, and I need to find money for it right now. I'm like, I don't know if that's a good idea yet, right? I promise you, when you're ready, I will be the first out there, like, helping you, like, go out and find this, right? And some of you are going to be ready sooner than others, and if nothing else, we're going to get you that feedback by the end of the year, right? And we are, the way I like to do it is I talk to people who are investors, who have invested, like maybe we're not having an investor conversation per se, we're having an advisory conversation. You're asking for advice. What is their perspective? Do they think this is interesting? Maybe they'll invest, maybe they won't. That's not your main goal. Your real goal is to get feedback, right? Of, is it interesting enough to pursue, and what kinds of questions do they ask? And so, that's where people like Rob at Halo Fund or Dan or some of these other ones that are advisors to the program are super valuable, because, or Casey and them, they may or may not invest right now, but they'll get you ready to do a bigger push. And that's when you put the funnel together and do this right. And sometimes on those advisory meetings, they get really excited, and you start to sense excitement, like, oh, you should talk to X, Y, and Z, and that gets you to that partner that you need to get to the next step. So that's my recommendation. But I'm open to argument too. If people don't like that, or if people have different experiences, then I think that's a worthy discussion. So that's basically where I wanted to leave off. Yeah, we have 10 minutes left.
So a question, in terms of the licensing option, at what stage of the patent filing do you start that discussion with, say, institutions who owns the patent rights? Provisional?
Yeah, after the provisional's been filed, right? If you know they're gonna file it, and you're like very interested, I don't think there's a problem to starting that conversation too early, because here's what they're likely to tell you. We can't give you a license right now because it's just you, and you don't have a plan, and you don't have funds, and we've issued licenses to inventors before, and they don't know what to do with it, and then the technology dies. And that's a fair criticism. They're obligated to put that to be a good steward for that technology. But what it does is it opens up the conversation. Okay, what would make you feel ready? Actually, I'm gonna go out and have these conversations. And is that okay with you? Because if you're gonna go shop it, right? I don't want to go try and put all this effort and time and social capital into assembling a team to get ready to have that conversation, and it turns out that they are partway down a licensing conversation with somebody else, or there's a firm that's interested or whoever. So they can be a partner to that process. So the earlier you communicate to them that it's something you're interested in, at least hopefully they'll keep you in the loop. Well, they kind of have to. It's hard to license without you as part of that part of that conversation. Yeah, I think open lines of communication are always good. Anybody else?
So you stress the importance of team building.
Yeah.
So how do we get started? Who is the most important person to approach, to recruit? CEO, where we can find those people with experiences in the space of biotech pharma in Houston?
Who's the most important to recruit is dependent on what your goals are. So, as George said earlier, you don't have to have a CEO right away. I've seen inventors, Estero from last year, they're doing wonderfully. Scientific founders, they had some really inventor conversations. They didn't like the terms they were getting offered because the terms they were getting offered was as a venture development deal, essentially, right? And they felt like it was a virtual company anyway, they could push it along. They wrote an SBIR, got an SBIR. They have a person set up in a lab over there. They still don't have a full-time CEO, but what they have done is they've recruited some operational people, project managers, those kinds of things. So if you're doing that kind of model, project manager to be a hire, or like an early outside hire. It could be a postdoc who's attached to this project who's super enthusiastic about it and wants to go down this path with you, right? And I wouldn't underappreciate that value of that excitement. They're not going to be super sophisticated. So if you do that, what I recommend is you pay extra attention to your advisors of who are you asking for advice from, both on a scientific advisory board maybe, but just as other advisors and the quality of your consultants. So they're not going to bring the credibility, but they'll keep you going. And sometimes just having an enthusiastic person who's actually in something full time, thinking about it all the time is incredibly valuable. On the other hand, it could be you have a CEO who's, you could have a CEO right at the start, right? They're your partner, they're going to help you figure this out. They're probably not getting in the lab and doing grunt work, right? But they think that they can help you get venture money faster, you can move a little faster. The vision that you have is big enough, it's not just one product and you're afraid if you fund it with grants, you'll spend so much time doing that on individual things, you'll never get the progress you need. So maybe you do that sooner. It's also dependent of who are you connected with that's enthusiastic, right? So part of the reason I say, and part of the reason this is a little fuzzy, is you have talk to advisors. Your advisor, good people don't often advertise when they're looking for stuff, right? Sometimes they do. Sometimes they're angel investing. But hey, they could go start another company if it was the right company, right? Or maybe they just put a little bit of money in if you look like you have it. They're open to either, right? Maybe they know somebody who's looking for their next opportunity. So what you're looking for is like excitement and people to get interested, and you're working on telling your story. And if you do that well and people are interested, as you start to have those conversations, you'll find people interested in it. Sometimes, if it's going really well, you'll find too many people interested in it, and the vultures will start circling, and you gotta be a little careful. So, is that helpful? I don't know if that's helpful or not. It's part of why we focus so much on connecting you to people. The default that's easiest to predict is that you will be, for the foreseeable future, kind of pushing this forward, and we're gonna put you into contact with consultants and stuff, and you're gonna be writing SBIR, and you're gonna hire a project. That's kind of the default. But be open to like having those partnering conversations and looking for people.
I mean, I'm not sure you know about this. So this is very complicated stuff because involving science, involving financial, involving legal things. So I don't think any of us can be expert in every area. So I'm just wondering, is there any software or platform can give you the option to say, well, you just input some number, input some details, and it will generate the whole package. Not like the tax filing software, right? You just answer a few questions and provide a number.
Do you find tax filing software easy to use? Because I don't. I think it's the way to.
Is there anything on this side?
Yeah, kind of. Yes. My goal in all of this is not to make you an expert. I'm not trying to make you a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. My goal is not to make you an expert in any of this. be it the regulatory stuff we're gonna talk about, or manufacturing, whatever. We're not trying to make you experts. We're trying to make you good partners to the process, and so you know what you're involved in, and so you have expectations around how do you push it forward, and you can have a better quality of conversations with people. So there are software for startup incorporation, for example. First of all, a good lawyer is basically just plugging into a template. It's like 2,000-3,000. So Egan Nelson, who we work with a lot, Andrew has one, Andrew Storm, you're gonna hear tomorrow. His firm has one. We can start a package essentially of, hey, they send you a spreadsheet. It's like, what's your name? Who's in it? What are your rough equity allocations? They're not gonna tell you what it should be. They might advise, depending on the lawyer, they may advise on what's typical, what they've seen. They're not gonna tell you what it should be per se. And then like Gust has one that's like that startup package, plus you can start doing early equity issuances and non-disclosure agreements or consulting agreements for the founders back to the company to create those obligations pretty cheaply. Again, it's actually only a few $100s. So there's a few different electronic platforms. You know, I've not used them. I don't know if I would advise them. I think they can be great. Like, I think they're fine. The basic paperwork's basic. It's fine. Either way, you still want to have like a relationship with like a law firm because it adds so much credibility. So that way investors are talking to you, like you kind of go, and don't get a crappy law firm, like get a good one. So that way it's like, oh, it's Egan Nelson, or oh, it's Hogan Lovells, or it's whoever, and like they do this all the time, and so we know it's going to be right. So I don't know if that's helpful. As far as like fundraising, there's tons of platforms that say they'll help you fundraise, and I don't know if it's that easy. It'd be great if it was that easy. Any other questions? I know we're like right at lunchtime, so we're gonna pick this up on Thursday too to make sure we answered everybody's questions. And this has been a lot of material, really dense. We distributed. Last minute thoughts, comments?